Isabeau of Bavaria, or Elizabeth von Wittelsbach as she was known when she was born, would be variously described in history as a beautiful woman, an ugly woman, a woman who commanded respect as regent, and as a woman who didn't know what she was doing politically. Wife to the mentally ill Charles VI of France, Isabeau's time as queen would be beset with challenges and political rebellion, and much of what is known about her reflects the changing environment and divisions of France at that time. Isabeau was a daughter to one of the most powerful families in the German states, the Dukes of Bavaria. Her father was Stephen III of Bavaria-Ingolstadt, and her mother was an Italian noblewoman called Taddea Visconti, and she was born around 1370, most likely in the city of Munich. While Isabeau's family branch was not necessarily the most important of the Bavarian dukes, she was still descended from her great-grandfather, Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, and Charlemagne through her father, and both sides of her parentage boasted several lands under their control across Europe. She would have had the best upbringing possible for a young girl at the time, as she was nobility. This would have included learning to read and write, music and dancing, languages, and not just understanding how to run a household, but also how to behave at court. Certainly from a young age, Isabeau was marked out for a future at court in some capacity, as was her only sibling, her brother Louis, and this would have been a main focus. Her mother died when she was 11, but Isabeau seems to have maintained close ties with the rest of her family, as evidenced later in her life through letters. Not surprisingly, given her lineage and upbringing, it wasn't long before Isabeau's future marriage was thought of. Her first proposal came when she was about 13 in 1383, when her uncle, Duke Frederick of Bavaria-Landshut, first suggested a match with the young Charles VI of France, who had become king just a few years earlier in 1380 when only 12 years old. For France, Isabeau represented an alliance against the English, as the German nobility had roots and alliances of their own with the Holy Roman Empire and the growing might of Spain. Charles himself was eager to be married, and he was an attractive, healthy young man who was, obviously, a king. It was a good match for any princess. Although little is known of the relationship between Isabeau and her father, there is some suggestion of the protective, fatherly care he had for her in regards to her marriage. He was adamant that Isabeau should not actually know she was going to France to be considered as a possible bride, and he agreed only reluctantly, with the understanding that she would not, as was custom at the time, be inspected while naked. Initially, Isabeau believed they were travelling to France only under the pretext of taking a pilgrimage to Amiens. However, about a month before going to France, Isabeau went to Hainaut to stay a while with her relatives, with her uncle, Duke Albert I, Count of Holland, and his wife Margaret of Brigue. This was primarily to prepare her for the French court, firstly by swapping her Bavarian style of clothing for French dress, which was considered more suitable for courtly attire. While she would also have learned etiquette as a child, Margaret no doubt taught her the finer etiquette required at the French court, which at the time was considered to be one of the leading European courts in culture and style. Isabeau was a quick study, easily learning what she had to in a short amount of time, indicative of her later displays of intelligence and quick-wittedness. On the 13th of July 1385, Isabeau finally travelled to Amiens to be inspected, and she apparently had perfect manners throughout, according to contemporary chroniclers. On the 17th, Charles himself finally laid eyes on his new bride, and he reportedly fell instantly in love with her, or in slightly less romantic fashion, at least immediately found her attractive. Jean Froissart wrote that the king felt happiness and love enter his heart, for he saw that she was beautiful and young, and thus he greatly desired to gaze at her and possess her. We're not actually sure what she looked like, as there are directly competing descriptions of Isabeau. Some say she was tall and blonde like the fashionable ideals of the time, while other descriptions of her say she was short and brunette like her mother with her beautiful dark Italian features. Either way, the young couple were married a few days later on the 20th of July, a mere week after she had first arrived. Her new husband had left the day after their marriage to wage a military campaign against the English, and Isabeau went to stay with his step-great-grandmother, Queen Dowager Blanche. And by all accounts, he doted on his new wife, lavishing her with gifts of tableware, jewellery and clothing. Isabeau's presence was political from the start. Aside from the fact her marriage had been encouraged by Philip of Burgundy, whose interests aligned with those of her family, she was approached in the late 1380s by the Florentines at court. They wanted her help in what became known as the Jean Gilezzo-Visconti affair. Jean Gilezzo had disposed of and murdered Isabeau's maternal grandfather, Bernabo Visconti, and then married his daughter Valentina to Louis I, Duke of Orleans, the younger brother of Charles VI. He formed an alliance with the Duke of Burgundy at court. We can already see how this was going to get messy. While she had little influence at this point, Isabeau was able to help form an anti-Gilezzo faction with her brother, Louis, and John III, Count of Armagnac. On the 23rd of August 1389, Isabeau was finally crowned in a lavish ceremony that included her formal entry to Paris, despite having been married for 4 years at this point. There were entertainers and acrobats, and the women who accompanied Isabeau were dressed in outfits trimmed with gold thread. Most theatrically of all was the moment as the new queen passed over the Grand Pont de Notre Dame, however, in which a person dressed as an angel was lowered by mechanical means through the blue fabric swathed overhead, placing a crown on Isabeau's head. After the coronation, a huge feast was held alongside narrative pageants that were planned for only the first day of 5 days of festivities. Isabeau was 7 months pregnant at the time with her second child, and she fainted, probably from a combination of the heat and exhaustion. Isabeau would have 12 children in all, and unusually for the time period, all of them are very well recorded. Her first child was actually born in 1386, a boy named Charles after his father, but he died while still in infancy. Her second child was a girl named Joan, who was born in 1388 but passed away at just 2 years old. These must have been devastating losses for Isabeau and Charles, not only because these children represented the continuation of the French royal family in an unbroken line, but also because they were committed parents, and Isabeau was well known for keeping her children close to her at all times while they were young. The child with which she was pregnant during her coronation was Isabella, who would go at an extremely young age to marry Richard II of England, but would live only until she was 19 years old during her second marriage. After this came Joan, born in 1391, and their first surviving son, again named Charles, but he would sadly die aged 8 of a wasting illness. Then came Michelle, born in 1395, Louis in 1397, John in 1398, Catherine of Valois in 1401, who would go on to marry Henry V of England, and yet another Charles in 1403, who would become Charles VII on his father's death. Their final son was born in 1403 named Philip, but he died while still a baby. Isabeau ensured her children travelled with her whenever she could. She brought them gifts and arranged for her daughters as well as her sons to receive the best education possible. However, in 1392, Isabeau's role as queen would be upgraded due to events regarding her husband Charles. On a hot August day that year, he was leading an army on the way to Brittany when he experienced the first of what would sadly be many bouts of insanity over his lifetime. Apparently, the king had been feverish and incoherent in the days leading up to the event, but on this day, a crazed man reportedly rode through the woods and charged at the king's horse, shouting, "Ride no further, noble king! You are betrayed!" The king's knights pushed the man away and they rode out of the woods. When they did so, one of the pages dropped Charles's lance with a loud clang which spurred the king into a frantic and unprovoked attack. Drawing his sword, he began to attack his own men, including his own brother Louis, and 4 of them died. Afterwards, the king fell into a coma for 4 days. Whether or not the events leading up to the attack are true or fabricated to help understand Charles's state of mind, his sudden onset of madness was seen by many as either divine punishment or magic. His uncles, the Dukes of Berry and Burgundy, who had previously been pushed out by him, used his illness as an opportunity to place themselves as regents for him. They dissolved the council of advisors Charles had surrounded himself with, made up of clerics and lesser nobility. Many of them fled for their lives, and Philip of Burgundy set himself as the head of the government. Louis was denied any position at all, but Charles, whether from genuinely forgetting his uncle's further troublemaking or simply because he was too nervous to fight it in his current state, did nothing to change this, and instead thanked his uncles for taking the reins. He had only come out of his coma thanks to the ministrations of Guillaume de Hassigny, a famous 92-year-old physician who also suggested a programme of entertainments to rouse the king from his illness. After Charles was returned to Paris in September, the courtiers came forward with ideas, and in 1393, one courtier suggested an event that would have catastrophic consequences. This would come to be known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. The suggestion was that Charles and a group of courtiers should dress as wild men of the woods and surprise Isabeau and her ladies during the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. Just the thing for recovering from a mental health crisis. It went about as badly as can be imagined. A lit torch brought by Louis, Duke of Orleans, set fire to one of the courtiers' costumes, which spread quickly, killing 4 men and almost killing the king. It was a disaster which confirmed for many that the king wasn't fit to rule, and public unrest threatened to spill over into rebellion. It was a pattern that would continue over the years as Charles went through episodes of his mysterious illness, but he would progressively grow worse. As it became clear he was never going to fully recover, despite some periods of lucidity, Isabeau began to distance herself slightly. This began partially because in his worst states, Charles didn't even recognise the Queen and would ask for her to be removed from his presence. For a woman who had obviously been loved by her husband, it must have been a horrible experience for Isabeau. Eventually, it would be decided that it was best if a mistress was provided for Charles to prevent Isabeau's distress when he didn't recognise her. This was reached with Isabeau's consent, and the woman chosen was named Odette de Champdivers, the daughter of a horse dealer who was said to resemble the Queen. In his lucid periods, the king would continue his romantic and sexual relationship with his wife as though nothing had happened, and equally she showed him affection and gave him gifts during those same periods. It's clear that Isabeau was ensuring the best possibility of maintaining the crown for her children while distancing herself when needed. Isabeau, although she was not yet in a great position of power compared to the regents, began to exercise the political muscles she did have. By April 1396, between her father losing importance and the king's madness, Valentina Visconti had to leave court under accusations of witchcraft. Charles was furious at Galeazzo for other reasons, including that he had tried to turn the Pope against France, and so the Florentines at his court were being listened to more. At the wedding in the same year of her young 7-year-old daughter Isabella to Richard II of England, Isabeau would negotiate an alliance between France and Florence with the Florentine ambassador. It wasn't the only time her diplomatic skills were recognised either. Since 1378, the Western Schism had existed, a split in the church in which popes in both Rome and Avignon claimed to be the true pope. It was, of course, all tied into political allegiances, but in the 1390s, Jean Gerson, who was later the Chancellor of the University of Paris, formed a council to discuss how to repair the rift, and he invited Isabeau to sit on it. The French wanted both popes to stand down in favour of reforming a single papacy in Rome, and the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, was very favourable to Isabeau being part of the council. It shows that she was respected for her skills as a mediator and politician, and that being a woman didn't prevent Isabeau from taking part. This will partially have come from the medieval idea that a queen was a mediator on behalf of her husband, and that she had an important role as a peacemaker. Isabeau was simply extending this queenly duty further into international politics that involved most of Europe. But Charles himself would go further than this. During one of his lucid periods in 1393, he proclaimed that Isabeau was to be the principal guardian of his son, the Dauphin, which also gave her more power on the Regency Council over the king's uncles and brothers, as well as making her co-guardian of all their other children. The following year, Isabeau was able to take control of the Regency Council, and while this gave her more power, it also made her more vulnerable to attack. Louis, the Duke of Orleans, became the official tax collector for the crown, and this gave him financial control when combined with the several vassals he obtained between 1401 and 1403. He and Isabeau came to an agreement in the early 15th century to raise taxes, and this was compounded in 1401 by Louis installing his own men as tax collectors in order to increase the kingdom's finances by including their own wealth. But what really caused a problem was that Louis's acquisition of these lands bordered many of Philip the Bold's and threatened others the Duke of Burgundy was set to inherit. There were only so many times Philip would ignore this, and in that year on the 7th of December, he raised an army of nearly 700 men, entering Paris and threatening violence. Once again, however, Isabeau's silver tongue saved the citizens of Paris as she intervened between Philip and Louis and helped them reconcile. She did so well with this that in 1402, Charles trusted his wife enough that he allowed her to continue soothing the dispute between the Burgundians and the Orleanists, and he even turned the royal treasury over to her control. However, when Philip the Bold died in 1404, his son, John the Fearless, became Duke of Burgundy, and he set his sights on gaining access to the royal funds. Louis, of course, distrusted John and made it clear he thought the Burgundian Duke was going to usurp power for himself, neatly forgetting that he was likely doing the same thing. Isabeau, sensibly but still provocatively, put her children first and sided with the Duke of Orleans. It was in their interest to keep friendly with their uncle over a cousin of the king, and she also felt John was acting outside of his station. However, this of course led to rumours that the Queen was sleeping with Louis, which was the height of scandal not only for being a supposed affair, but because she was a queen, and because as in-laws their relationship would have been considered incestuous if it had been true. An Augustinian friar called Jacques Le Grand gave a sermon in which he was careful to present it as an allegory, not a direct attack on the Queen, in which he suggested Isabeau was somewhat loose with her morals because of her dancing, and her dresses showed too much décolletage, shoulders and neck, a pattern which continued to be used against women with too much power for centuries afterwards. Modern historians are split on this issue, some thinking there may have been something to the rumours of Isabeau's affair. After all, she was in a marriage where her husband didn't recognise her most of the time, and it's possible she grew close to Louis, and others point out that it's highly likely those who didn't like a woman being in charge, and especially didn't like the Queen's tax rises, would have created this rumour in order to denounce her. Pro-Burgundian propaganda also hinted at the lewdness of a queen sleeping with her brother-in-law, and it's far more likely the whole thing was a rumour, although we also can't deny there's a chance it was built on some truth. John, however, went for something more tangible. He accused Isabeau and Louis of being fiscally challenged and demanded reparations for the loss of his royal revenues after his father's death, as more than half of the Burgundian crown's revenues had come from the French royal treasury in his father's time. He used this as a reason to mount yet another army of 1,000 men, this time entering Paris in 1405. The Duke of Orleans and Isabeau fled to the castle of Melun with her household and children a day behind, with John in pursuit. His men caught up with the household and he took the Dauphin Louis, Isabeau and Charles's third son. The boy was returned to Paris under Burgundian control, but John, Duke of Berry, his uncle, took him under his protection at the behest of the Royal Council. Charles was actually having a better period, and he helped calm down things for a month or so before relapsing. The Duke of Orleans raised his own army, and although John the Fearless attempted to make the Parisians revolt, they remained loyal to their king and his son. Yet again, Isabeau would be the one to mediate the conflict, this time following a letter from a woman who was probably Europe's first paid female writer, Christine de Pizan, and at the request of the Royal Council. But on the 23rd of November 1407, the Duke of Orleans was murdered by being dragged from his horse and hacked to death, his body left in a gutter. It was a horrifying event, and at first, John the Fearless denied any involvement. However, it was obvious who had carried out the orders, and he quickly changed his story and admitted he had ordered the Duke's murder after all. But, he added, that it was in fact for the Queen's honour, to restore it in light of the many rumours about her affair with Louis. Aside from the fact it was Burgundian propaganda to start with, it's obvious that really he was taking out Isabeau's greatest political ally with whom she had seen eye to eye. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the French royal family were not glad to hear about Louis's death and John's casual confession, and they forced him to leave Paris, while a peace negotiation was enacted between the Orleanists and the Burgundians at court. Unsurprisingly, violence broke out after the assassination, and Isabeau immediately had guards stationed around Paris to protect the Dauphin. Once again, she fled to the safety of Melun with her son and other children, but by August 1308 it was safe enough to once again bring him back to Paris, which was done in grand style. Isabeau's main problem now was that she had lost her biggest political ally. She has often come under criticism for not forming a party around herself, especially to protect her son's right to the throne, but this comes from a position of assuming there were political parties the way there are now. Alliances were loose and often based on trusting just one person in a group who shared a viewpoint, and shifting sides would not have been seen in the same way as now. This explains both Isabeau's ability to change who she aligned herself with and also why she never created a strong group of people around herself who shared her views. To help with his son's power during a more lucid moment, Charles arranged for an ordinance that gave the 13-year-old Louis more power if his mother wasn't present. This both protected the Dauphin and made it clear it was Isabeau holding the royal power behind the throne. Around March 1408, various chroniclers attempted to explain John's actions, trying to justify it by explaining Louis had apparently become a tyrant, and that actually, John had done the crown a favour by getting rid of him. It was a crazy leap, but with Charles not being of sound mind at the time, the king was convinced and pardoned Duke John. However, he had revoked this pardon by September. It became much more important for those who wanted to be in charge to have both Isabeau and Louis physically in their grasp. This meant Isabeau had no choice but to frequently change sides and flip between the Burgundians from around 1409 to 1413 and the Orleanists from 1413 to 1415. At the Peace of Chartres in March 1409, a grand spectacle was made of the fact that the royal couple had reconciled with John the Fearless, and Isabeau herself bestowed the title of Guardian of the Dauphin on the Duke and allowed him to mentor the young prince. This flip-flopping between everyone made Isabeau very unpopular, and although she was obviously trying to do what was best for her son with an incapacitated husband, many thought it showed her as flaky. Regardless of anyone's attempts to make peace, the tension had brewed for too many years, and in 1411 it broke out into the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. While Duke John initially had the upper hand, the Dauphin Louis was now 15 years old, and began to prove himself pretty handy at being in charge. While he couldn't hope to match the Burgundian forces, he did begin to build up a support network of close advisors and men, and Christine de Pizan, still patronised by his mother, wrote a glowing piece about how he was the saviour of all France. However, Isabeau had spent many years in charge, essentially, by this point, and it turned out she was unwilling to hand over the reins of power to her young son. She aligned with the Armagnacs, and in a true act of teenage rebellion, Louis decided to join John the Fearless. Henry V, now King of England, took full advantage of the situation. He invaded the northwest coast of France in 1415 and crushed the French forces sent to defend against him at Agincourt. It was devastating for the French, who lost huge numbers of men and military leaders in a single day. All Duke John had to do was simply to remain neutral as Henry continued relentlessly taking towns and cities in the north of France. However, in December of that year, the Dauphin unexpectedly died of an illness at the age of 18. Isabeau and Charles's fourth son, John of Touraine, now became the Dauphin. However, he had been brought up in the household of Duke William II of Bavaria in Hainaut after arrangements were made for him to marry the Duke's daughter, Jacqueline. So it was a shock to no one when he proved to have Burgundian sympathies, and on top of this, William refused to send him to Paris while the violence was still taking place. In 1416, Isabeau saw a possible way for a reconciliation to be made and tried to arrange a meeting with her daughter-in-law Jacqueline. However, the Armagnacs had no interest in peace being made with the Burgundians, and equally the young couple was still unable to travel to Paris, so it never happened. Things grew worse in 1417 when Henry V invaded once again, this time into Normandy. This was compounded in April as the Dauphin John died, leaving only one royal son left to take the place of heir, Charles, who would go on to become Charles VII of France, but he was still aged just 14. He was betrothed to Marie of Anjou, the daughter of the leader of the Armagnacs, Louis II of Anjou, and so naturally sided with them. Louis now kept Isabeau prisoner, confiscating many of her goods and separating her from her household and children in order to keep her compliant. She switched her allegiance to the Burgundians, and with the help of John the Fearless, she was able to secure her release, although many said John only helped in order to maintain control over the Queen. By January 1418, both Isabeau and John were acting as joint regents, and they got rid of Parliament before taking control of Paris in May. However, Dauphin Charles refused to enter the city by his mother's side, and a supposed reconciliation wouldn't happen until the 10th of September 1419. The two sides met at a bridge in Montereau, but in reality, it was a ploy to get John alone. Charles then took the opportunity to have him killed, hacking his body to pieces. King Charles immediately disinherited his son, but on the plus side, the civil war ended with John's death. In that same year, Henry V had occupied Normandy fully, and to make things more difficult for the French, the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had allied with the English. There was effectively no current heir available for the French throne either, as Dauphin Charles had been disinherited, and the next in line after that, Charles of Orleans, had been taken prisoner by the English. Isabeau, however, remained loyal to her husband, and it was obvious she was the person to speak with. Henry sent a messenger to arrange a meeting with the Queen, not with the King. It was clear a compromise had to be reached, and Isabeau travelled with Charles in May 1420 for the King to sign the Treaty of Troyes. However, Charles was too ill to sign, leaving Isabella to do yet another thing for him. This cemented her reputation as the woman who had signed away France, as although Charles remained king, Henry kept the territories he had gained, including Normandy, and he was to marry their daughter Catherine. This was part of a plan for him to become King of France after Charles's death, governing France alongside Philip the Good, and allowing Isabeau to reside in English-controlled Paris. However, in 1422, not only did Charles VI die, but so did Henry V, leaving Henry's young son Henry VI to become King of France in his place, with John of Lancaster acting as regent. Isabeau was now in her 50s, and she was described by some people as living quite a loose life. In other words, once again, there was a smear campaign to discredit her. This is considered to probably have been English propaganda to cement their hold on the French throne, as Isabeau was a competent alternative to a small foreign child and an English regent. Rumours of her alleged affairs began again, and this time there were whispers that the disinherited Dauphin was in fact not the son of Charles VI at all. Oddly, at the same time, there were also pamphlets that compared Isabeau to Joan of Arc, who had come on the scene, and claimed she would still save France. It was obvious Isabeau's political influence was too great, and she was removed from the political sphere altogether. She was sent to live at the Hôtel Saint-Paul, and she would remain there until her death in late September 1435. Her body was sent on a funeral cortege along the Seine, and her funeral was documented by the eyewitness Jean Chartier of Saint-Denis Abbey. In the centuries that would follow, Isabeau would be painted as an incompetent queen playing with power, without the political acumen to back it up. She was accused of being a bad mother, despite evidence now showing she was a devoted mother who kept her children close and tried to act in their best interests. The king's madness even created rumours that she was a witch and had cast a spell on him, and accusations of adultery followed her for decades, casting aspersions on her character whenever her political opponents needed ammunition. In other words, her political character assassination was unique for the time because she was a woman, and not many women were in the political sphere. In truth, Isabeau appears to have not only been a model queen, but a trailblazer of her time when it came to politics. In an era when women were not openly allowed to be politicians, Isabeau handled alliances, treaties, and remained fluid in a changing situation in order to maintain the throne for her children. She was admired by many, including Christine de Pizan, another woman who broke the mold in her time. She was also loyal to her husband to the end, and while his illness meant that many times she could have claimed power for herself or aligned with someone who would have taken her husband off the throne, she both remained by his side and probably also recognized it allowed power for herself. In short, Isabeau does not deserve to be remembered as a treacherous, adulterous woman, but instead as a politician trying to deal with a difficult and violent period of time, above all, still being a queen and a mother to the end. Few medieval queen consorts split opinion quite like Eleanor of Provence. On the one hand, she was a loyal queen to Henry III, defending him against rebels when needed, and being a powerful regent in her own right. On the other, she was hated for bringing her French relatives over with her to take people's jobs at court, and she was quite keen, it seems, on expelling Jewish people from her lands. These are facts about the woman, but is this a woman with a hideous personality hidden beneath her legendary beauty, or was she a product of her era? Eleanor's beginnings sound like the start of a children's fairy tale. She was born in Provence in 1223, although we don't know exactly when. She was one of 4 daughters born to Ramon Berenguer V, Count of Provence, and his wife Beatrice of Savoy. The couple had 2 sons born before Eleanor, possibly twins, but they both died young. The 4 daughters, Margaret, Beatrice, and Sanchia, other than Eleanor herself, were famed for their beauty, and Eleanor would become known for her dark brunette hair and striking eyes. She was the youngest child, and despite her parents being somewhat impoverished for nobility, she still received a good education. Eleanor, along with her sisters, had the tutor Romer de Villeneuve, a senior official at her father's court. He was a trusted man who would go on to become Beatrice's guardian after Ramon's death, and it was through him Eleanor would gain a deep love of reading, which would follow her into adulthood. Provence, like much of France at that time, had a well-known troubadour culture that likely led to Eleanor enjoying romantic novels, and in adulthood she would have a particular penchant for Arthurian legends. They would also have learned their native tongue of Occitan, which was close to French, and would have learned to read and write Latin for the purposes of letter writing. They would also have learned to ride a horse, falconry, and all 4 women would be well versed in the fashion of the day. Her eldest sister, Margaret, or Marguerite, had been her closest companion, but was married to the French king, Louis IX, when she was 12 in 1234. Her new mother-in-law, Blanche of Castile, had arranged the marriage specifically with the view that Marguerite was merely pretty and pious, wasn't politically savvy enough to attempt to wrest control from Blanche, and to increase the lands held under the French crown. Henry III, King of England, wanted to try to do the same, especially as his father, King John, had lost the Angevin lands once held by their family. Marrying the right Frenchwoman would help with his cause, or so he hoped. Marguerite's family had hoped that through her marriage they would be more involved in the French royal family and their politics, but after the bride travelled to Paris, her uncles and entourage were sent home, leaving her alone and under the manipulation of Blanche. The Count and Countess of Provence were irritated by the Queen Mother's treatment of them, and luckily for them, Blanche hadn't made friends in other places as well. Both Henry and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II were suspicious of her, and their own bond was further cemented when Frederick took Isabella, the king's sister, for his third wife. Seeing where it would be possible to gain an advantage, Henry sent ambassadors to Provence to seek out a wife there. However, he was already going through the motions of marrying his distant kinswoman Joan, Countess of Poitou, and Blanche had already made clear she didn't want this marriage to happen anyway. When Eleanor's parents agreed to an English match instead, Joan was let go, and Henry made arrangements to marry Eleanor. Her parents were still unable to pay for a decent dowry, and Henry wrote no less than 6 letters for his ambassadors to present to the Count and Countess, starting at £13,333 and going down to £2,000. Eventually, he panicked they would refuse the match altogether on this basis, and the king wrote one final letter telling his envoys to forget altogether about the money and simply to come back with his future bride. This shows the tension and level of fear that circulated in Europe at this time over gaining lands and therefore resources, and how this was achieved through marriages as much as war. On the 23rd of November 1235 at Tarascon Castle, Eleanor went through the motions with a proxy marriage before travelling to England on the 15th of December. Henry was apparently nervous awaiting his bride, and when Eleanor finally landed with her uncle, William of Savoy, and a large retinue of Savoyard relatives in Dover in early January, he rushed to Canterbury. It would have been the first time the couple had ever seen each other, and Henry's Anglo-Norman and Eleanor's Occitan would have been close enough for them to understand one another. He was around 28 and Eleanor was at least 12, possibly 13. They were married at Canterbury on the 14th of January 1236, and she became the Queen of England, Lady of Ireland, Duchess of Normandy and Aquitaine, and Countess of Anjou, although many of her titles relating to France were somewhat redundant and wouldn't be used after the Treaty of Paris in 1259. Despite their age gap, Henry was an attentive and caring partner to his young wife, and he had a special skill in putting people at their ease. Up until that point, the king's only attachments to the fairer sex had been his mother, his sisters, and 2 nuns, so he was quite shy with Eleanor romantically, a contrast to his father and forebears. She was crowned on the 20th of January, and the occasion was set with flags, banners and lanterns all across London, and a blue carpet was laid from Westminster Palace to the Abbey. Henry went first, with Eleanor following behind, her long hair loose and wearing a simple circlet on her head. Now officially queen, not only would her main role be to produce an heir for the English throne, but also to intercede with her husband on behalf of his subjects. Eleanor was immediately asked to appeal on behalf of William de Punchhall, a man who she didn't know, who had committed a forest offence such as poaching, and it was granted. This was almost a tutorial to guide the young queen through how she should act. Due to her age, Eleanor's education continued until she was old enough to participate fully in the systems of queenship, and this included being brought into Henry's religious leanings. He was known to be especially pious, particularly towards Edward the Confessor, who he adopted as his patron saint, and both Eleanor's medical care and religious guidance were entrusted to Nicholas of Farnham, who later became the Bishop of Durham. Henry was extremely religious, and he was eager that his wife should be just as into it as he was. Apparently, the pair were affectionate and caring towards one another, and Eleanor truly seems to have loved her husband and been a faithful and loyal wife, and Henry was a devoted husband. The proof of this can be seen in a rather shocking and horrific event, in which a man turned up at court claiming to be the real king and demanding Henry abdicate immediately. The king took pity on this man as he was clearly suffering from a mental illness, and he forbid anyone to harm the man as he was let go. It would be a grave error. Just a few nights later, the same man crept through the king's open window to stab him to death, but found an empty bed as Henry was sleeping with Eleanor in her chambers. Someone finally caught him creeping around, and this time he was taken to Coventry and quartered. Henry's switch in mercy was said to be not because the man had threatened to kill him, but because he had threatened to kill the Queen. But for all their happiness, there were fears for a short while that the young Queen might not be able to have children, when it's far more likely she simply didn't fall pregnant straight away due to her young age. However, she was finally carrying the future heir to the throne by Christmas of 1238, and although she had moved around constantly with Henry's court since her arrival, the king wanted his queen to remain at Westminster once the birth grew closer. Eleanor gave birth on the night of the 17th to the 18th of June 1239 to a boy named Edward after Edward the Confessor. Henry was overjoyed, as were most of his subjects, as young Prince Edward represented a secure passing of the throne, as well as the first king since the Norman conquest to be given an English name. Eleanor's churching, the first official ceremony for a queen which celebrated her return to public life after having a child, was arranged for the 9th of August, and London was flooded with noble women to attend on the Queen. One of these was Eleanor Plantagenet, the king's sister. She had been married once before and widowed before she was 20 years old. She had married for a second time to Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who was also a close advisor and friend of the king. However, there were controversies surrounding their marriage, starting with the fact Eleanor had taken a vow of chastity after becoming a widow, and also for the fact they had been married in secret. Although it appears Henry was fully aware of the marriage and appears to have approved, giving them lavish gifts and allowing them to stay in his properties in London after they were married and had their first child, he wouldn't remain this way forever. As the Queen's churching approached, the king suddenly banned both his sister and her husband from attending the ceremony and threw them out of their London residence. It turned out Queen Eleanor's uncle, Thomas of Savoy, had come to the king with a large debt that, he said, Simon de Montfort owed him, and had put Henry down for the surety of it. The king had already paid out a huge amount of money for his sister's wedding, and now Simon had put him down for another £1,333. The real sticking point wasn't the amount, however, but the fact he had made a decision to put a debt to Henry's name without informing him or asking. It was an arrogant move, and despite both Eleanor and Simon coming to beg the king for forgiveness, he remained angry about what had happened. He then added that Simon was an excommunicated man, and that he had only agreed to the marriage to his sister as she had been seduced by de Montfort. He threatened to lock Simon in the Tower of London, and the couple fled to France. Queen Eleanor almost certainly would have mourned the loss of her sister-in-law as the two had grown close. The de Montforts had fled so quickly that they had to leave behind their baby son, who was being raised in the royal nursery alongside his newborn cousin Edward and another cousin of theirs, 4-year-old Henry. They would be followed by other royal siblings, all born before Eleanor was 23. Margaret, born a year later in 1240, followed by Beatrice in 1242, and Edmund in 1245, who would go on to become the founder of the first House of Lancaster. They also had one more daughter on the 25th of November 1253 named Catherine, and there are various sources alluding to the fact she was deaf and possibly had an intellectual disability. Whatever the case, Henry and Eleanor loved her the same as their other children, and when she sadly died at 3 years old in 1257, the pair were heartbroken at the death of their little daughter. The children would be raised at Windsor Castle, and both the king and Eleanor were doting and attentive parents, made clear both by the vehemency of their feelings and the fact that they often spent large amounts of time with their children, in opposition to what was expected of royalty at that time. Now comfortable in her role as queen, it wouldn't be long before Eleanor's relatives saw a way to ingratiate themselves into English politics as she grew into an adult. Her uncles William, Thomas and Boniface of Savoy had all used her influence with the king, but in 1241 it was her uncle Peter of Savoy who would throw himself into the role of Eleanor's advisor. The English courtiers who would normally have found a place amongst the staff at court were understandably jealous of the Savoyards, who now found themselves by the side of the king, and this was made worse by Peter's conduct. He did help Eleanor to strengthen her own position as mother of the future king, but he also used her help in gaining positions for more of their relatives. And this was made worse when the king's half-brothers travelled over from France to find there was little left of the pie for themselves. A year later, Eleanor accompanied Henry on what was to be an ill-fated expedition to Poitou and Gascony in 1242. Henry's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, had remarried and become the Countess of Poitou, and she had reassured her son that her new husband, Hugh de Lusignan X, would support Henry in reclaiming French lands. At that time, Hugh was involved in a rebellion against King Louis, and the rebels had hoped Henry would provide military support. However, the English king was slow in gathering an army, and considering the rebellion had kicked off in 1241, it was a year late. It was a slow campaign as well, and it wasn't helped by Hugh switching back to supporting Louis halfway through. Henry's army was surrounded by the French during the Battle of Taillebourg, and he had to retreat to Bordeaux after a one-day truce was agreed. His actions made Simon de Montfort openly criticise the king for his incompetence, another nail in the coffin of their strained relationship. As for Eleanor, she had remained at Bordeaux, having fallen ill during her pregnancy, and on the 25th of June 1242 she gave birth to their daughter Beatrice. She was also angry when she heard about the retreat, but for a slightly different reason to Simon. The truce had only been agreed as Henry's brother, Richard of Cornwall, carrying a pilgrim's staff, had entered the French camp and asked personally for the truce. In exchange, he demanded Gascony from his brother as his birthright of Poitou was now lost. Henry agreed in his desperation, except Gascony was supposed to go to his eldest, Edward, to rule while he waited to succeed his father. One can only imagine the arguments between man and wife. Gascony was withdrawn from Richard, and things grew somewhat heated between him and Eleanor as he suspected her involvement. Eventually things calmed down, but the memory of the event remained. However, the two could also work well together. When Henry left in 1253 to repress a rebellion in Gascony, Eleanor remained behind this time as regent, and Richard stayed on also as her chief advisor. Henry's trust in her cannot be underestimated, as she was even allowed to exercise the functions of the Lord Chancellor, a position that would not be held by a woman again until Liz Truss in 2016. Also, before Henry left on campaign, he drew up his will, instructing that Eleanor should be given full custody of their children and would hold the king's lands until their son Edward came of age. But aside from Henry's trust, there were other periods of Eleanor's regency that would be historic. One of these came on the 27th of January 1254, when for the first time, a woman acting as the head of state summoned and presided over Parliament. Although Richard was there also to give support, it was Eleanor who issued writs in her name, and it was Eleanor who led the Parliament through a diplomatic mandate. However, by April the 1st that year, Henry had signed a truce with his enemies. By December, the royal English couple were invited to Paris to spend some time with Louis IX and Queen Marguerite. But one issue with this truce was that their second son Edmund would now no longer receive the Earldom of Chester, and so finding something else for him became a problem. But Henry decided he had a solution. His second son would be the King of Sicily. The previous king, Frederick II, had died in 1250, and Pope Innocent was eager to give the throne to anyone but Frederick's heirs. So Edmund had been offered the throne, and the English king had accepted on his behalf. Eleanor also became deeply involved in this scheme along with her Savoyard relatives. The Pope dispatched his notary, Albert of Parma, to negotiate with Henry while he was still in Gascony, to find out when they could expect 9-year-old Edmund and the army he would need to travel to Sicily with. However, it quickly became clear that Henry was completely broke after his campaigns in France. But this was also a build-up of tensions from earlier events, especially those in 1255. Henry and Eleanor had increasingly grown worried about their 15-year-old daughter Margaret, who had married the 14-year-old Alexander III of Scotland, as she was not permitted by the Scottish to travel down to England. This was at least in part because the Scottish Minority Council, ruling until Alexander was of age, had split into factions not long after the marriage in 1251. But it was also partly because Margaret wrote home long letters full of homesickness and complaints that she was never allowed to see her husband, and therefore the Scots were worried Margaret might stay in England if she was allowed to return. The Queen's physician was sent to check on Margaret, and he was horrified to find her ill and pale, sending a letter home just before he died, shortly afterwards himself. Some thought perhaps of poison. The letter was alarming enough that Henry sent John Mansell and Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, and they surrounded Edinburgh Castle with troops and forced their way in. Margaret complained about not being allowed out of the castle, how she was given unfamiliar handmaidens, and again, how she wasn't allowed any time with Alexander. The two men fixed the third problem by putting the two young people together in the same bed and sent word back to England about her situation. Unsurprisingly, Henry came down hard on the two men who were meant to look after Margaret, and one of them, Robert de Ros, had to surrender Wark Castle near the Scottish border. Both Margaret and Alexander travelled there to meet with Eleanor and Henry, and Eleanor fell ill while at the castle, which meant her daughter was permitted to stay with her while the king and his son-in-law went north again to deal with the Minority Council. By late October 1255, Eleanor felt well enough to travel south again, and a bill was sent to the Bishop of Durham for her stay. Henry also took the opportunity to gather up income for Eleanor in the form of her Queen's Gold, an extra payment of 10% added on to fines paid to the Crown. But this would be made worse by targeting the Jewish community within England. In late November, Henry ordered that the Jewish community in Lincoln pay out £172 from confiscated property. This property had belonged to Jews who had been accused of apparently kidnapping and murdering a young boy, throwing his body down a well, and had since been punished with hanging or imprisonment. The problem was that very little was actually known about the way the boy had died, and as so often happened in the medieval period, a scapegoat was decided on, and the finger was unjustly pointed at the Jewish population with no evidence. In 1257, Eleanor and Henry had to deal with the death of their youngest daughter Catherine, who was only 3 when she passed away on the 3rd of May. Matthew of Paris, a chronicler of the time, wrote that the little girl was speechless and helpless, but very beautiful in appearance, and added that Eleanor had something of a nervous breakdown. At the end of May, Henry had collapsed with a fever, but he ensured Westminster Abbey was completed in time to allow little Catherine to be the first member of the royal family to be interred there. Her tomb had a silver effigy on top and was encrusted with jewels. Her tomb has long since disappeared, but the way in which Henry and Eleanor reacted to her death shows the strong emotional bond they held with all of their children. By 1258, there were other matters to attend to, however. The crippling financial demands of the offer for Edmund to be King of Sicily had pushed the English populace too far, and it spilled over into rebellion. The Lusignans were actually behind some of this, and they led the English barons in a revolt. The king was broke, everyone was sick of the Sicilian business, the harvests failed that year, and even the church now had grievances. It wasn't until 7 of the English and Savoyard barons joined together, Simon de Montfort, Roger and Hugh Bigod, John Fitzgeoffrey, Peter de Montfort, Peter de Savoy and Richard de Clare, that things erupted. They formed an alliance with a view to pushing the Lusignans out of court, a move that was likely quietly supported by Eleanor, although it weakened her husband's power. Fearing he would be arrested, Henry agreed to abandon personal rule and instead rule through a council of 24 barons, although his own candidates included many of the hated Lusignans. In June, a fresh parliament passed the Provisions of Oxford, which further limited Henry's powers, and on top of that, Eleanor and her husband both had a falling out with their eldest son, Edward. She began to be seen as the enemy of reform. In 1261, Eleanor colluded with a small group of loyal activists who wanted to work with the king, and the Pope released Henry, Eleanor, and their sons from needing to follow the provisions. By June 1263, tensions had risen further from this decision, and the rebels were now being led by Simon de Montfort. In retaliation for Eleanor's choices, they ravaged her lands and those of anyone who supported her, including her relatives. Civil war openly broke out, and Simon turned his forces on London. Henry and Eleanor were trapped within the Tower of London, but Eleanor did attempt to travel along the River Thames to her son Edward and his army at Windsor, but instead had to retreat as she found herself pelted with stones, rotten vegetables, and vicious insults by an angry London mob. They had been taught by this point to hate the Queen, and especially a foreign one. All the blame for the wrong of the country, claimed the rebels, was down to the overly large number of Savoyards in the government. And whose fault was that? However, this would also be Eleanor's greatest hour. The Royalists were defeated at Lewes in May 1264. While the rebels basically took power, although ineffectively, so they struggled to hold it well enough to actually take the country, it crippled Henry to little more than a figurehead. But his queen was not so easily daunted. A few months before, she had gone to France to seek support from Louis, and she found it, although this sparked the Civil War as much as anything else. Her son Edward was now a hostage in Simon's hands, and Eleanor knew she would have to fight back to reclaim her son's birthright. Selling the crown jewels and borrowing heavily from every possible quarter, she travelled to Flanders to assemble an impressive invasion force. But unfortunately, she ran out of money while waiting for Simon to stop stalling over Edward's imprisonment, and her army dissipated. But she still wasn't done. The English Queen marched on Gascony, claiming it for herself as Duchess of Aquitaine. She once again raised another military force, smaller but just as loyal, and this, combined with her extensive network of contacts from France, the Papacy, Ireland, the Welsh Marches, and the English refugees in Europe, gave her the edge she needed. Eleanor was proof that diplomacy was just as effective a weapon as a sword when fighting an enemy, and her actions finally led to victory for the Royalists at Evesham in August 1265, when Simon was killed and mutilated by the victors. Just a few months later in November, Eleanor returned to her husband's side. There is no doubt that it was the Queen who had secured a victory for Henry, and furthermore, she even covered her debts from her time in Gascony by persuading the Pope to give her £60,000 from a fine taken from the English clergy. And certainly, finances would mark the later years of her life. She was markedly oppressive when it came to taxing the land she owned, but she also used the services of Jewish moneylenders while she was consort. However, she was a woman of her era, and she was hostile to Judaism, like many other medieval people. When Henry came back into power, he was much more infirm, and Edward took on a more prominent role. The king reversed many of the anti-Jewish laws Simon had put in place, but as his finances looked more dire, he was put under pressure from Parliament to restrict the sale of Jewish bonds to Christians in return for financing. But on the 16th of November 1272, Henry, who had been ill for a few years at this point, finally died. Eleanor was with him at the end, a final mark of her affection for her equally loving husband. She also became, upon his death, a very wealthy woman. However, with his death went any attempt at balance. Edward was crowned king on the 19th of August alongside his wife, Eleanor of Castile, yes, another Eleanor. Now a Queen Dowager, Eleanor of Provence stayed on in England and even helped to raise her grandchildren. When her grandson Henry died in her care in 1274, aged just 6, she was as heartbroken as she had been when Catherine had passed away. She founded Guildford Friary in his memory and gave orders for his heart to be buried there. The tragedies didn't end there, as her daughters Margaret and Beatrice soon passed away in the months following this. But the softer side of Eleanor soon gave way to her harder side, and on the 16th of January 1275, she received permission from Edward I to expel the Jewish people living in her lands. This was an event that would stick in the minds of many and was used as an entire character basis for Eleanor. There was a sweeping wave of anti-Semitism across Europe, and Eleanor was swayed herself by the Franciscan and Dominican friars who urged people to expel Jewish communities. However, this is not necessarily indicative of her character, nor is there an obvious connection to the other measures Edward carried out against Jewish people in England that year. When we look at her personal life, it becomes more confusing, as Eleanor took at least one Jewish family into her protection, but was unable to help them when they were expelled from the country. On top of this, she remained a patron of a home founded by her husband for converted Jews. It suggests that in modern terms, we would certainly not like Eleanor's anti-Semitic leanings, but in her own time, it was complicated for her as she swayed between the average Christian teachings she was told were right and her feelings for actual people she knew. While Edward continued to value his mother's input on political matters, he was a far firmer king than his father had been, and Eleanor was probably a little put out that he didn't heed her more often. She began to make plans to retire, and in July 1286 she left for the nunnery at Amesbury to take the veil as a nun. Two of her granddaughters were already there, Mary of Woodstock and Eleanor of Brittany, who had both entered the priory at the age of 7 respectively. Just a few years later, on the 24th of June 1291, Eleanor of Provence died. Although there was some confusion over where she should be buried, eventually her body was interred at Amesbury Priory on the 9th of September, her funeral attended by both of her sons, relatives and a host of nobility. Regardless of how Eleanor was remembered by her English subjects, she was revered by her children and family. Today, Eleanor is barely remembered at all, and if her name comes up, most people first think of the worst crimes attached to her name. But the real Eleanor of Provence was a fairly admirable figure if we view her, as we should with all historical figures, in the context of her time. She arrived in England as a young girl with no knowledge of what lay ahead, but she created a new model for queenship in her adopted country, creating a partnership between king and queen that would have implications for centuries afterwards in the English state. She was also formidable when it came to fighting for her place and that of her loved ones. Henry could be nothing but grateful to his wife, for it was her contacts, diplomatic ability and sheer stubbornness to back down that helped win the Barons' War in his favour and cement a royalist win, also securing the throne for their son. Much of the views surrounding Eleanor, that she was troublesome and apt to push her husband to war, also stemmed from a view held of Henry, that he was a gentle king who liked things easy and peaceful, therefore couldn't possibly be the one creating all the problems. Except Henry was determined from the start to win back what his father had lost in France, and marrying Eleanor was merely the beginning of that process. Between the two of them, they also created the first stable archetype of the royal family by being devoted and affectionate parents to their children, as well as continually fostering links between siblings and relatives. But it's impossible to ignore that Eleanor was of her era, a queen who put herself above average citizens because she was raised to believe in a God-given hierarchy, a woman who was anti-Semitic because of the Christian teachings of the day, and a landowner who was harsh on those who needed to pay her tax or queen's gold. She was therefore complicated, but also expected. But most of all, despite what we see as serious shortcomings, Eleanor provided an example of strong leadership and queenship, and deserves to be remembered not only for her few faults, but also for the impressive legacy she left for her children to follow. The events of the Wars of the Roses in England are famous. But what was happening in the adjoining and proud country of Scotland while blood was being spilt further south? At a time when Margaret of Anjou would flee north with her son to safety, she would be met not with a Scottish king, but with one of the most unconventional Scottish queens of the period, Mary of Gelders. Mary was born, as her name might suggest, in the Duchy of Gelders, an area that today is known as Gelderland in the Netherlands. She was born on the 17th of January 1433, the daughter of Arnold, Duke of Gelders, and Catherine of Cleves, who was a great-aunt of the famous Anne of Cleves. Much of her early life is unknown, but as a daughter of the nobility, she would have been educated in the skills required of a noblewoman, such as being able to read and write, dance, and able to run an estate. But when Mary was about 12 years old in 1445, she travelled to Brussels to live in the household of her great-uncle Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, and his wife Isabella of Portugal. It was normal for noble boys and girls to go and live for a while with a relative, to build relations and strengthen ties between families that were often spread around Europe by marriage. But Mary was unusual in that she stayed on at the Burgundian court longer than most. Philip and Isabella wanted to arrange a marriage for Mary to Charles, Count of Maine, brother-in-law to Charles VII of France. But oddly, the marriage was called off when Mary's father, Arnold, admitted that he was unable to afford the dowry for Mary. This left Mary in a difficult position. She stayed on at the Burgundian court, becoming a lady-in-waiting to Philip and Isabella's daughter-in-law, Catherine of France, but her expenses were often covered by her great-aunt Isabella. By the same token, the same expense accounts mention Mary had 10 attendants of her own. This shows there was probably a balance going on between Mary needing to show her social status and the reality of being a poor relation. However, it wouldn't be long, despite this setback, that the issue of marriage would be raised once again. In 1446, James II of Scotland decided he would pick up a new wife on the continent. He wrote to France to renew the Old Alliance, asking advice of King Charles VII for who that wife could be, and was told to look to the Burgundian court instead. By April 1st, 1449, a marriage was agreed between James and Mary, and an accord was found between Scotland, Burgundy and Gelders. This time, the dowry of 60,000 crowns was paid by Philip, and her trousseau was provided by Isabella. In early June, Mary set sail for Scotland with her entourage at the age of around 23. The Burgundian family she left behind were reportedly emotional at Mary leaving, a hint at her amiable personality and likability. She was under the care of the Lord of Vere, only stopping at the Isle of May to pray for a short while. The entourage disembarked at Leith before continuing on to Edinburgh. Nothing is really known of how Mary felt, but it's likely she had been well prepared for her future role, and on July the 3rd, she married James in Holyrood Abbey. Shortly after, she was whisked away to be dressed in purple robes and crowned Queen of Scotland. Mary was now the wife of James II and Queen. She arrived at a complicated point for James's personal relations. Only 19 when he married, James had been under the regency of Sir Alexander Livingston for many years, ever since he had become king at the age of just 6, following his father's assassination. But Livingston had also placed the Scottish king's mother, Queen Joan, under house arrest in 1439. She was only freed when she agreed James would instead be brought up with the Livingstons, and her dowry had to be handed over to pay for him. Livingston had also used his position as regent to kill off some of his enemies, and James had never forgotten any of this. He also needed a bit of spare cash to pay for Mary's dowry. Feeling more confident of his position now he was married to Mary, James had Livingston and some of his family arrested, and a few of them executed. Their lands and cash now became the property of the crown. A mere day after the executions, Mary was gifted several estates and castles by her new husband. She was pregnant by January of 1450, fulfilling the first of her queenly duties. Sadly, this first child was born far too early in May of that year and lived only a few hours. We don't even know if it was a boy or a girl. But by December, Mary had once again conceived, and in July 1451, she gave birth to the future James III. She would go on to have 5 more children: Mary, Alexander, John, Margaret, and David, who sadly would not survive infancy. Mary had done her part then in securing the line for the Scottish throne. But was she involved further with her husband's rule? There unfortunately aren't many records for Mary's time as consort, but from those that do exist, it seems husband and wife worked well together. Mary also successfully argued on behalf of those requiring forgiveness or favour with the king, yet another duty a queen had been expected to do for centuries as a peacekeeper. Mary was also pious and was involved in charity in the church, being integral in the observant friars coming to Scotland. She founded a friary for them in Edinburgh, and outside the city, Mary also founded a hospital for the poor. During the early 1450s, Mary would also have witnessed the struggles James had in shaking off the Douglas clan, who grew in power after the Livingstons were dropped, something that existed until May 1455, when he defeated them at the Battle of Arkinholm. In 1454, she was likely present at the siege of Blackness Castle, and James gave it to Mary as a gift. In short, Mary was the perfect queen consort, and her husband seemed to get on well with her. James's victory over the Douglases was in part due to modern artillery, something James was enthusiastic about. For the next 5 years, James took no prisoners, and he became ambitious in expanding his lands and castles. Knowing the Cousins' War was keeping the English busy, James decided to besiege Roxburgh Castle and regain it for the Scottish crown. For the siege, James took with his army a large number of the latest cannons. On the 3rd of August, one of them exploded while being set off, and unfortunately for the Scottish king, he was standing too close to the cannon. His thigh bone was snapped in two according to a near contemporary source, and he died from his injuries at the age of 29. Mary was now a young widow, but worse than that, the heir to the throne, James III, was just 9 years old. It was history repeating itself, and Mary did not want to give up her son as her late husband's mother, Queen Joan, had been forced to. The Scottish forces continued their assault on Roxburgh Castle, capturing it on the 8th of August. It would be razed to the ground after the battle. Mary arrived with James III on the same day, and he was crowned 2 days later on the 10th, and it was agreed that Mary would have custody of her young son, becoming regent. Mary's conduct over the last 11 years was obviously enough to convince others she would be the right person. But Mary also wanted to pay homage to the memory of her late husband, as well as using his memory to cement the legacy of their son. In the autumn of that year, she founded a collegiate church of the Holy Trinity near the hospital she had created outside Edinburgh. She also began work on Ravenscraig Castle, both as a memory to James II and as her dower home, which she lived in while it was being constructed. Ravenscraig was also the first castle in Scotland designed to be resistant to artillery fire. Of course, Mary didn't rule alone as regent. Looking out for her son's interests alongside Mary were a council of advisors, most notably Bishop James Kennedy, who she chose as her chief advisor. While none of them probably wanted a woman in charge, Mary proved herself an able and capable administrator, and much like the famous Elizabeth I a century later, was willing to listen to the advice of those around her without being swayed in the wrong direction. Scotland was also increasingly close to being dragged into the Wars of the Roses further south in England. There was no avoiding it. Bishop Kennedy favoured an alliance with the Lancastrian house, while Mary thought it more sensible to play the two sides off against each other. Despite this, Mary and Kennedy still got on well and had a well-functioning relationship. Mary's policy was an intelligent one, however, as favouring either side would have been detrimental to Scotland's interests, given that the houses of Lancaster and York were in a fluid period. The Wars of the Roses soon came to Scotland as the English royal family fled there. Mary had no choice but to offer sanctuary to Henry VI, his wife Margaret of Anjou, and their son Edward of Westminster. In 1460, Mary would once again have to offer refuge to Margaret and young Edward when they fled north, this time without the English king. Despite her initial policy of playing one side against the other, Mary was sympathetic to the English queen and her son, taking Edward into her own household to keep him from Yorkist hands. While there are no contemporary sources explaining Mary's position, we can reasonably assume the two women found common ground as royal women holding a position of authority within the framework of the men around them. Margaret of Anjou had dealt with the English court and parliament by herself as Henry VI fell into periods of stupor caused by an unknown illness, and she would later organise forces to fight on behalf of her husband's cause for the throne. The two women also hammered out a deal between themselves to create ties between Scotland and the Lancastrian cause. Mary offered Margaret loans and Scottish troops to fight for her husband and son's claim to the English throne, and in return, she demanded Berwick-upon-Tweed. Margaret was willing to give up the town on the Anglo-Scottish border, and a betrothal was also agreed between Edward of Westminster and Mary's daughter Margaret to unite the families. However, ever the pragmatist, Mary had to consider more than just two countries. When Edward IV took the throne in England, his sister Margaret of York married Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, bringing the Burgundian court into the war. Mary would certainly not have wanted to be on their bad side. At that time in the 15th century, Burgundy was a wealthy and powerful duchy, and it was far more in Scotland's interest to remain neutral. As a result, while Margaret of Anjou sent Scottish troops to fight for her husband, relations between the two women cooled somewhat. This worsened when Edward IV, seeing what a problem a Lancastrian-Scottish alliance would be, proposed marriage to Mary of Gelders. While Mary turned him down eventually, she did consider the proposal for some time. It's obvious that Mary's interests, quite rightly, lay first with what was best for Scotland. Pressure was also put on her to break off the betrothal between young Edward and Margaret, which happened, much to Margaret of Anjou's disappointment. Eventually, in 1462, Mary paid the English royal family to leave Scotland, once again placing her country in a safe, neutral position. Thanks to Mary's careful manoeuvring, as well as her unique position as a female regent, she was able to aid a fellow royal mother for as long as possible, while eventually ensuring Scotland's safety against a war that threatened to drag much of Europe in.
However, by July 1463, Bishop Kennedy was pressuring Mary to once again join with Margaret of Anjou in a military campaign against the House of York. Margaret of Anjou briefly returned to Scotland, and Mary was present at the siege of Norham Castle in Northumberland with Henry VI and his forces in 1463. The Lancastrians, however, held the castle for just 18 days. It was a spectacular defeat for them, and Mary removed herself quickly with her army back to the safety of Scotland. Just a few months later, she grew severely ill. Mary died in December 1463 at the age of just 30. Her death left the young James III without parents and also under the control of Bishop Kennedy and his supporters. However, Mary's legacy continued after her death, with the peace process she had begun with the House of York, something that Bishop Kennedy saw would be fruitless to go against. Her short 3 years as regent had seen her become an astute and intelligent political leader, and there's little doubt she would have been her son's most trusted advisor had she lived long enough to see James III in his majority. And she had also become known for her remarkable building efforts, for the imposing Ravenscraig in Fife, her religious buildings, and her hospital. In the Victorian era, many historians tarnished Mary of Gelders' name with suggestions of more than one affair. No contemporary sources stated this, and it seems likely that stories of Queen Joan, Mary's mother-in-law, got muddled up with other rumours about Margaret of Anjou, and the historical waters were muddied. Mary appears to have been, on top of everything else, a queen faithful to the memory of her husband and more concerned with her son's future rule and the safety and security of Scotland. Overall, Mary was a most unconventional queen. As Queen Consort of Scotland, she provided her husband with heirs, one destined for the throne of Scotland and other children married to further the reaches of Scotland's royal family across Europe. She was supportive of her husband, but her later actions as Queen Regent show she was likely an able advisor while James II lived. And as Regent, she was a pragmatic and astute politician, leading her country through a safe position while war loomed in England, as well as not being afraid to use military force when necessary. While the Wars of the Roses raged further south, Mary of Gelders was the leader Scotland needed to set the tone for the country's early peace with England, as well as proving a female ruler was more than capable of looking after a throne. Isabella of France would go down in history not as a badly treated queen, a shrewd diplomat, or an intelligent, feisty woman, but as a she-wolf. This insult pushed aside the entire character of the medieval queen and left only a hollow caricature. In reality, only her adultery prevented her from being seen as a liberator of England. This is the real story of one of history's most well-known femme fatales. The exact date of Isabella's birth is uncertain, but based on chroniclers of the time, she was likely born around 1295 in Paris. She had illustrious parentage. Her father was Philip IV, King of France, and her mother was Joan I of Navarre, Queen of Navarre and Countess of Champagne in her own right. Her father Philip, nicknamed the Fair for his tall stature and good looks, was considered a silent, despotic king, once described as not a man or beast, but a statue. He was a feared and respected king who increased the wealth and land of medieval Europe's most powerful country, but was by all accounts devoted to his wife. Her mother Joan was a beloved and efficient Queen Consort of France, providing her husband with 3 surviving sons and 1 surviving daughter, as well as being demure and respectful in all regards. However, she was also a strong and capable leader of her domains, and repelled attacks not once but twice on her lands, also founding the College of Navarre in Paris. There's little doubt that Isabella would have grown up knowing what was expected of a queen consort, but also what a royal woman was capable of, and possibly the incorrect knowledge that all kings were like her father. Isabella appears to have been given a good education despite being female, and was taught to read. Although there is no evidence she learned to write, she would always have a love of books, and the fact she sent letters suggests she understood writing. Her life was also a privileged one, and she would have grown up with a strong sense of importance as the descendant of kings, queens, and saints. She was betrothed from a very young age, however. Philip wanted only to make France stronger and guard his kingdom against the Flemish. There was a long-standing feud with England over territories that were now under France's crown, and Philip wanted to repair this, as well as prevent Edward I, King of England, from making an alliance with the Flemish. Suggested by the Pope, 2 marriages were agreed. That of Edward I to Philip's sister, Marguerite of France, and of Edward's son, Edward of Carnarvon, to Isabella. While the details of the proposal then dragged on for many years due to Edward I attempting to play for the best political match possible for his son, he finally agreed to the marriage in 1307, shortly before he died on the 7th of July of that year. Now Edward II of England, the new king had showed little interest in his bride, but could not afford to lose Gascony, the territory that would become England's again upon his marriage, especially as he now also faced conflict with Scotland. He sent envoys to France to prepare for the marriage in Boulogne. Like most royal women of the time, Isabella was described in glowing terms for her beauty, but there is no specific description of her, only that she resembled her father more than her mother. This suggests she may have been tall with blonde hair, and this is corroborated by 2 statues in Beverley Minster and Winchelsea Church in Sussex, said to be of her, which show a round-faced woman with curly blonde hair and high eyebrows. Unusually for the time, chroniclers also commented on her great intelligence. And perhaps this might have been the start of a great partnership between 2 royals. Except that there was a third person in this marriage. When Edward was about 15 years old, his father decided it was time he had some male friends, and one of those who joined his household was Piers Gaveston. Piers was the same age, handsome, had impeccable courtly manners, and had already been part of 2 military campaigns. He was also indiscreet, arrogant, and ambitious. And while he could be accused of sometimes being disrespectful to those above him, he charmed Edward. It was said the prince entered into an enduring compact with him, which has been taken to mean they entered into the medieval practice of blood brotherhood. While 2 young men being so close, especially in an era when men were often away together on military campaigns for long periods of time, wasn't unusual, the relationship between the prince and his new favourite was enough to draw comment. Many chroniclers contemporary to events suggest their relationship was more than mere brotherhood or friends, while some outright remarked Edward wanted to sleep with Piers. However, both men would also go on to marry and father children, and while this could simply be considered their duty, Edward also had at least 1 child with a mistress. Therefore, while modern historians remain divided on the subject, it seems highly likely from the evidence that exists that Edward and Piers were at minimum in a close friendship to the exclusion of all else, or possibly that they were gay or bisexual. But while in the 14th century anything other than heterosexuality was viewed as a sin worthy of severe and sometimes fatal punishment, it was actually Piers's exclusive access to royal patronage that was so distasteful to the nobles of the court. On the 25th of January 1308, the marriage of Edward and Isabella finally went ahead at the cathedral at Boulogne-sur-Mer. Isabella must have been pleased with her first sight of Edward. He had inherited his father's height at 6 foot and was described as handsome, strong, and had shoulder-length curly fair hair, beard and moustache. He dressed to impress and spoke Norman French as his mother tongue. The importance of their marriage was obvious by the guest list. No less than 8 kings and queens were present. There's no evidence they underwent the traditional bedding ceremony, but this could be as much down to Isabella's young age as to any possible disinterest on the groom's part. During a feast held as part of the 8-day wedding festivities, Philip IV warned Edward against thinking about annulling his marriage as certain persons in England had suggested, meaning Piers, as Gascony was England's only through marriage to Isabella and was destined for the children they would have. Isabella's first sight of England was on the 7th of February, when their ship finally landed at Dover. To everyone's horror, when they stepped onto the dock, Edward ran up to Piers and greeted him in an embarrassing display of affection and kisses, calling him brother, as Isabella and her uncles who had travelled with them looked on in astonishment. Whether or not Isabella knew of the rumours about her husband before her marriage is uncertain, but she would have been greatly offended by Edward showing his favourite more affection than herself. But the insults didn't stop there. Isabella soon found out that the income she expected to live on was non-existent, and there was no treasury money with which to dower her. On top of this, many of the jewels her father had gifted her and Edward with, as well as jewellery Isabella had brought as part of her trousseau, had been given to Piers by the English king. She found out when she saw him wearing some of it. An end was only put to it when she wrote to Philip, putting her fury down onto parchment, and her equally infuriated father demanded his new son-in-law put down in writing what he intended to give Isabella each year to live on. The fury of the nobility against Gaveston would only increase with the coronation of the royal couple. On the 25th of February 1308 at Westminster Abbey, the coronation of Edward II and Isabella of France went ahead, all organised, of course, by the king's favourite. As grand and full of pomp as the ceremony was, the royal couple were not the star attraction. Instead, Piers stole the limelight in what was probably the most insulting way possible. He arrived in a pearl-studded silk robe in imperial purple, a colour usually worn only by the monarch. Added to this, he was carrying St. Edward's crown, a privilege usually for the highest-ranking noble of the kingdom, and Piers had only just been elevated into the peerage. One earl only held himself back from giving Gaveston a beating because he was in front of the Queen and inside a church. It got worse at the coronation feast at Westminster Hall, at which Edward chose to sit with Gaveston rather than his wife, and Piers had also oddly decided to display the king's coat of arms with his own. Isabella's uncles Louis, Count of Evreux, and Charles, Count of Valois, were horrified. They returned to France spitting with fury for their kinswoman, and certain the rumours about Edward and Piers were true. The Queen Mother also left court and returned to Marlborough Castle, leaving her niece with no one to ask about aspects of queenship and no one to confide in except her French ladies-in-waiting. At just 12 years old, Isabella would have to rely on her instincts. Edward was not turning out to be the king she had thought he would be either. Unlike other medieval kings, Edward appeared to be disinterested in tournaments and military matters, and enjoyed rustic pursuits, such as digging ditches on his estate, thatching, swimming and metalworking. He was also down to earth, and made friends easily with common folk from all walks of life, which horrified the nobles and their ideas of social order. He also enjoyed theatrical shows and singing, something which was shocking at the time, but to us seems like Edward was a cultivated man who loved the arts. In short, the king didn't seem to want to be a king at all, but he was also pious, visiting shrines and giving alms generously. He was also a good and loving father to his children that came along later, but none of that made people respect him as a leader. To start with, Isabella was too young to wield any political authority, but as she grew older and wanted her part in politics, Piers was still in the way. But she had made friends with the barons over the years too, and they were firmly on her side with wanting Gaveston gone. This was, for them, mostly because he was a gatekeeper to royal patronage, accepting bribes and favours when instead the barons should have been able to speak directly with the king. At first, with the support of her father, Isabella covertly lent her support to the enemies of Piers, but she was wise enough not to publicly show any hatred towards Gaveston, lest it damage the relationship she was attempting to build with her husband. But her father, Philip IV, was all too happy to publicly announce his support for the barons unless Gaveston disappeared from the picture. Edward was left with no choice but to exile his favourite to Ireland in 1308, but as a result he started to show more respect to Isabella. He assigned her lands and more patronage, ensuring she had a proper income, and her father withdrew his support for the barons. For a while, their relationship improved, but by 1309, Gaveston had returned from Ireland. This time, however, Isabella seemed to find a working relationship with him. Perhaps the three of them realised they were stuck being a threesome, and as ignoring Isabella would earn the wrath of her powerful father, it made sense for there to be some way of working together. Isabella also felt she was in a stronger position than she had been, as she built up her own allies at court, primarily in the Beaumont family, originally from France like herself. Edward, however, was losing what little control he had of his barons. This was part of the reason that in 1311, Edward finally was pushed to go to war, this time in what would be a failed campaign against the Scottish. This was partly to appease the barons, and partly to establish a court away from Westminster to make things easier for himself. Isabella travelled north with him, but it was going to be a dangerous trip. The English army was sent to Scotland, but as not many of the barons had decided to support the king, it was a weak army. Robert Bruce had ensured no provisions for them either, by destroying crops in the Scottish borders and moving livestock north, and so faced with starvation, the army moved south again. This was too much for the barons, who rose up against their king, and in June signed the Ordinances of 1311, a series of 41 regulations they imposed upon Edward. Edward was outraged at the amount of limits they wanted to put on his power, but he was most aghast at Ordinance 20, which stated that Piers had to leave the realm forever. On the 16th of August, Edward met his parliament and tried to plead with them. He would follow everything else, provided they allowed Gaveston to stay. The barons were unmoved. Despite the troubles she had with Edward, Isabella chose to stand by his side against the barons. She sent letters to her French uncles asking for their aid against the uprising, as well as a number of letters to her other supporters asking the same. But Edward had no choice but to agree by September the 30th. By the 1st of November, Piers had to leave, and he eventually went on the 3rd. But it was short-lived. Piers had returned by Christmas of 1311 and was reunited with the king in January 1312, probably at Knaresborough. The reason for his return might have been the birth of his daughter Joan, but the king used the opportunity to declare the ordinance against him unlawful and restored all the lands Gaveston had previously had taken away. By March, Piers was shoring up Scarborough Castle in preparation for the battle against the Lords and had been excommunicated. The barons had divided up the realm to oppose Edward and planned to capture Gaveston. Throughout all of this, Isabella stood with her husband, and in so doing, also with Piers. She would have agreed with Edward against the king being stripped of his royal powers above all else, and it's even possible that, having been pushed into his company so often, she found Piers an acceptable companion who was no longer threatening her position as he once had. She even went out of her way in December 1311 to send a gift of luxury foods to Gaveston's wife, Margaret de Clare, when she was pregnant, further proof of Isabella softening towards Piers. Isabella would soon be pregnant herself, the threat of war overshadowing what was otherwise a happy triumph of her queenly duties. In April, when the barons began to move north, Edward and Gaveston fled to Newcastle upon Tyne, leaving Isabella to follow at a slower pace, likely because of her pregnancy. She finally arrived around the 20th of April, but her husband sent her to Tynemouth Priory for safety, a place that would allow Isabella to escape by sea if necessary. However, on the 4th of May, the Earl of Lancaster's army had reached Newcastle, and Edward fled to York to raise support, while he left Gaveston back at Scarborough. They had fled by boat from Tynemouth Priory, and despite a tearful Isabella begging to go with them, Edward had refused. The Earl of Lancaster was her uncle, and there is proof he meant her no harm by way of a secret message which was sent to her assuring her of the same, and merely that they wanted Gaveston gone. But it seems likely that Isabella did not receive the message, as she left the priory in a hurry, leaving many of her possessions behind. By the 16th of May, she had rejoined the king, but it's not hard to imagine she was pretty angry with what had been her near escape, and the fact that the king was happy to leave her and his unborn child behind. Piers did not escape, however, finally being captured after he was stranded at Scarborough Castle. He was taken to Warwick Castle, condemned to death, and on the 19th of June, Guy de Beauchamp and Thomas of Lancaster took him out onto Lancaster's land at Blacklow Hill, where he was run through by two Welshmen. The favourite was dead. When Edward found out about Gaveston's death, his first reaction was anger coupled with grief. He swore bloody vengeance on those who had killed his beloved, and this would overshadow much of his life. But what did Isabella feel? We don't know her actual feelings, but by the 29th of June, she wrote a letter to her husband expressing sympathy and outrage for Piers's death. It suggests she felt more strongly about the correct order of things than for her husband's favourites, at least for now. But her mind turned to other things, as in the autumn of that year she travelled to Windsor Castle to prepare for the arrival of her first child, and was joined by her aunt, Queen Dowager Marguerite. On the 12th of November, Isabella's labour began, and Edward rushed to Windsor to be present. In the early hours of the morning, on the 13th of November 1312, she gave birth to a much longed-for son, who would also be named Edward. Isabella, now 17 years old, was secure in her position as Queen of England and mother to the heir to the throne. and her influence over Edward grew. But scandal was never far behind, and in 1313, Isabella and Edward travelled to France to drum up more support, as well as attend the ceremonial knighting of her brothers. The trip started out pretty well, with feasts and festivities, and Isabella's uncles put on a satirical puppet play for their guests. Afterwards, Isabella handed out silk purses she had made herself to her brothers and to their wives, her sisters-in-law. After returning home to England, Edward and Isabella held a great feast in celebration of their return in June of that year, and this feast included 2 French knights that had travelled back with them. To Isabella's dismay, she saw 2 of the silk purses, those given to her sisters-in-law Blanche and Marguerite, hanging from the belts of the knights. Although these could have been given only as gifts, Isabella seems to have got some evidence of wrongdoing, for on her next visit to her father in 1314, she informed him and suggested it was as the result of an affair the 2 women were having. The result was that both would be thrown into prison for the rest of their lives, and Isabella's reputation in France suffered for it. The Queen of England was starting to show she could be ruthless when she saw what she thought was wrongdoing against her person. Back at home, things got worse. Edward led another disastrous campaign against the Scottish in 1314, resulting in the Battle of Bannockburn in June. It was a turning point for the Scottish forces, and the English barons once again turned on Edward, blaming him for the losses. Isabella, yet again, remained on the side of her husband and stood by him. The most powerful of the nobles, the Earl of Lancaster, despite being her uncle, now saw Isabella as his enemy for this, especially as Isabella continued to grow her relationships with the Beaumonts, who Lancaster hated. He retaliated by ensuring that her income was severely cut, although this was also due to a changed situation in England affecting the economy. There were torrential rains that year that ruined the harvest, and this would continue for a few years, leading to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. On the 29th of November 1314, Isabella found out the sad news that her father, Philip, had died. Gone with him was also the stable support from France for England. In 1316, Isabella would give birth to her second son, John of Eltham. Unfortunately, not even this happy event could do much to improve the unpopularity of Edward II. Even his affable manner with the common people meant nothing now in the face of civil unrest, failing wars with Scotland, and unstable government. John Deidres, a royal pretender to the throne, appeared and claimed to be Edward II swapped at birth. For a while, the dislike of the real Edward II led some to believe John, and rumours abounded until his execution. Isabella was deeply upset by these events, and she responded by becoming even closer to the Beaumonts, especially her alliance with Henry de Beaumont. She also increased her role in politics, attending more council meetings and increasing her own land holdings. Her growing importance is clear, as in 1319, the Scottish general Sir James Douglas attempted to capture her at York for Robert Bruce. Once again, Isabella managed to escape in time, but suspicion fell on Lancaster for having helped with the attempted kidnapping. By 1320, Isabella travelled to France with Edward to ask her brother Philip V, now King of France, for help against the barons. By now, Isabella had also given birth in 1318 to her first daughter Eleanor, and would soon have her fourth and final child, Joan, in 1321. However, all this was made worse by the relationships that Edward was building. He had cultivated a growing alliance with the Despensers over the years, and in view of the vacancy Pierce had left years before, it was now filled with Hugh Despenser the Younger. He was the same age as Edward, and the same rumours of the two men sharing a bed abounded, just as it had between Edward and Gaveston. The Despensers were rivals of the Earl of Lancaster and his family, but they also, with Edward's blessing, began to increase their power base in Wales along the Marcherlands. This brought them into conflict with Roger Mortimer de Chirk and his nephew, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, who were to that point the most powerful barons holding English lands in Wales. Where before they had supported Edward, that support now melted away, leaving the king even more isolated at court. For Isabella, she must have been appalled that once again Edward was putting his controversial personal relationships above running the country. And unlike with Piers, the Queen found herself unable to work with Hugh in any way. By 1321, it became clear the Lancastrians could not stand Despenser either, and they demanded Hugh's exile. Isabella was asked to petition the king in order to help prevent another war. She did so, publicly going down on her knees and begging the king to set aside the Despensers in the face of keeping the peace with England's subjects. But in what must have felt like severe déjà vu, Edward refused. Her attempts were praised but had little impact. But an event involving Isabella was about to stir up popular opinion for her husband, provide the Despensers with a way back into court, and start another war. She went on pilgrimage to Canterbury in early October of 1321, but went very far out of her way with a visit to Leeds Castle in Kent. The castle was held by Lord Badlesmere, a steward of the royal household who had recently sided with Edward's enemies, and at the time he wasn't at the castle but his wife Margaret de Clare was. It's highly possible that Isabella went here on purpose with Edward's knowledge, and when she arrived and asked for shelter, Margaret Badlesmere was alarmed. She insolently refused the Queen entry into the castle, and when Isabella ordered some of her soldiers to force their way in, Margaret retaliated by having archers fire at them, killing 6 soldiers in the process. Isabella withdrew wisely to a nearby priory, but while she had been expecting some stubbornness, she was angered and stunned by the behaviour of Lady Badlesmere. She immediately wrote to Edward, who must have been delighted at the news, as it gave him the excuse he had been looking for. Showing himself infuriated by the behaviour to his beloved consort, the king sent a message to Badlesmere himself. Rather stupidly, Baron Badlesmere sent back a letter agreeing with what his wife had done. Edward declared he would make an example of his steward, and he sent the Earl of Pembroke at the head of his army to Leeds Castle. Roger Mortimer and Humphrey de Bohun rode out to help when Margaret wrote to her husband frantically, knowing she could not withstand a siege. It would be a mistake. Lancaster had never wanted Badlesmere as a steward in the royal household, and so he told the other Marcher lords to stay put, making it clear he was opposed to Mortimer and de Bohun's actions. The king's army surrounded Leeds Castle, and while Edward was away, Isabella was given the Great Seal to protect and assumed control of the Court of Chancery from the Tower of London. The majority of the earls in England were actually on Edward's side this time, as they perceived his actions, as he wanted them to, as the actions of a king, gaining vengeance for the slight to his queen consort. Leeds Castle fell to the king's forces on the 31st of October 1321, when Lady Badlesmere finally surrendered. She and her children were sent to the Tower, along with her sister and nephew, the first women to be held there in prison, and several of her garrison were hanged. It was the beginning of the Despenser War, as it was called. No longer would Edward II be viewed as a weak, feeble king, but in fact he now went the other way, proving that anyone who rebelled against him in any way would lose lives, goods, and even their families. All the rest of Badelsmere's castle surrendered to the king within the month. Isabella was given Leeds Castle and the goods within as compensation for what had happened to her, and she returned the Great Seal to her husband. The events at Leeds Castle seemed to be the first indication of Isabella being more cunning and sinister than before. Perhaps she was innocent of what was going to happen. Perhaps Edward had simply asked her to drop into Leeds Castle, out of her way though it was, to check on the Badelsmere family. Perhaps she had come up with the plan with her husband. We simply don't know. Knowing he now held the stronger position, Edward decided to push on with his army and deal with Lancaster's forces and the Marcher Lords. Going into Wales first in December, he quickly dealt with Mortimer's army, and the Mortimers submitted to the king shortly afterwards. By January of 1322, some lords had fled north to join Lancaster, but Edward's forces were now bolstered with fresh men from Wales. He went north, meeting the Earl of Lancaster on the 10th of March at Burton-on-Trent, but the Earl fled further northwards without a fight. The king's forces, led by Sir Andrew Harclay, met the Lancastrian army at Boroughbridge, holding the town's bridge over the River Ure. At least one chronicler, Robert of Reading, states that it was Isabella who sent word to Harclay, asking him to move south and hold the bridge. She also had supplies for the king sent to both York and Carlisle. At Boroughbridge, the king's army outnumbered the Earl of Lancaster's 700 men by 4,000, and so the ensuing battle was quick and one-sided. Harclay was given the title of Earl of Carlisle for his capture of Lancaster, who was taken to Pontefract Castle, given a show trial, and summarily executed on the 22nd of March. Edward's main oppositions on all fronts were now gone. Some historians in the past have asserted that throughout this period, from autumn of 1321, Isabella became a lover of Roger Mortimer. While this certainly had happened later on, it's doubtful their affair began this early. At this point, Isabella seems to have been supporting her husband's actions fully, against both Lancaster and the Marcher Lords. Mortimer also only appeared at court once, so they would hardly have had time to see each other. And from the time Edward had stormed into their lands, Mortimer had been in trouble. In January 1322, he was forced to submit to the king at Shrewsbury and was thrown into jail in the Tower. His goods and lands were confiscated, and his wife Joan was imprisoned with him. After the execution of Lancaster, Edward exacted bloody punishment on all of Lancaster's followers, beheading and killing many. When Isabella joined her husband at Pontefract Castle in April, she was probably horrified at the bloodbath taking place, and there is evidence she tried to intercede with the king for many of his prisoners. She successfully saved at least one of the barons, Lord Noville, but no others. However, Edward was going to cause another split between himself and his wife. The Despensers, who had fled abroad before the war began, were now invited back by Edward on the 8th of December 1321 under his protection. They had fought by his side over the next few months, with their return made official by the 11th of February. By the time Isabella arrived at Pontefract, Hugh Despenser resented her presence, and seeing how she wanted to save many of the prisoners, instead urged the king on with his tyrannical version of justice. In May 1322, Isabella and Edward travelled to York, where they would meet with the Parliament that would finally find the Earl of Lancaster's ordinances prejudicial to the crown. This would restore Edward's powers to their fullness. But although Isabella had remained steadfast and loyal throughout the campaign, And although she had urged her husband to stand up against Lancaster and his army, she was shocked by Lancaster's death. He was her uncle and a member of the nobility. His death set a dangerous precedent. And yet it was not the king Isabella blamed, but Hugh Despenser for his encouragement of the punishment. The Queen's hatred of the new favourite of the king would be Edward's undoing. Edward was now in the strongest position he had ever been in as king. He had 4 children, including a healthy son as heir to the throne. He had a supportive queen who was popular and loved by his people, and he had rid himself of any political adversaries who threatened his rule. But his relationship with Hugh Despenser would prove to be a mistake. Isabella had come to England perhaps with romantic notions of her new husband being like her father, and had found Edward wanting. Nevertheless, the French princess had styled herself as a popular English queen, doing her royal duties without complaint and keeping her fury about Piers Gaveston only in private letters. She had found a way to work with her husband's first favourite, despite the strain it must have placed on her marriage, and she had supported his wars. But now, the increased power of the Despensers and the continued tyrannical behaviour of Edward would drive an immovable wedge between Isabella and her husband. This would shatter not only her marriage, but the very peace and stability of England itself, and Isabella would rise briefly as its champion before becoming its most hated woman. We left Isabella in part 1 as a queen standing by her husband despite the damage he had done to their marriage with his personal relationships and the damage his wars had done to the peace and stability of England. But while Isabella had learned much over her queenship, she was about to become the saviour of England, as well as its most hated woman. By 1322, things had changed a lot for Isabella. She had gone from being a young French princess with little political influence, infuriated with her husband Edward II's infatuation with Piers Gaveston, to a queen who was mother to the heir to the throne, a powerful politician in her own right, and a consort willing to stand by her husband through thick and thin. There had been several wars, from conflicts in Scotland to outright civil war in England. But for all the years where the couple had worked well together, Edward's latest relationship was about to tear them apart irrevocably. While Isabella had grown her relationships at court amongst the nobility, most notably with the Beaumont family, Edward had grown closer to the Despensers, especially Hugh Despenser the Younger. Their relationship was so close that, just as with Piers Gaveston, rumours abounded that the two men shared a bed. But just as with Piers, there isn't really any evidence that this was the case, and although there were whispers of Edward being attracted to his male favourites even in his own time, it's equally as likely that the two men had sworn to each other as blood brothers. Today, we might call it a bromance. And where Isabella had found a way to work with Piers, she was unable to do the same with Hugh, who resented her presence. She hated Despenser, both for how much he was pushing himself equal to the king, and because Isabella blamed him for the death of her uncle Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster. Whether or not Isabella truly cared about her uncle is uncertain, but what is certain is that his death, as a member of the nobility, set a dangerous precedent. But it wasn't just Isabella who disliked the Despensers, and they were about to make themselves even more unpopular. On the 10th of May 1322, the elder Hugh Despenser was made Earl of Winchester, and it signalled the start of 4 years of tyranny. They would control Edward II from that point on to their own ends, and it was made easier by there being very little competition. When Edward had delivered swift retribution to those who stood against him, he had also removed most of the nobility that would have kept the Despensers in check. Removing these noble families and confiscating their properties had made the king very wealthy, and he bestowed many of his new properties on his supporters. However, one person didn't receive anything from Edward: his wife Isabella. She was also disgusted with his form of justice, as it extended to family members, widows, and the elderly of the men who had stood against the king. Many of Isabella's friends were affected, and chroniclers also condemned the king's actions. But the reality was that it was Despenser behind much of this. He imprisoned women and children, harassed widows and extorted their money, and even kidnapped a woman for a year until she agreed to hand over £10,000. The result of this was that everyone hated the Despensers even more, and the little bit of popular opinion the king had built up faded away. The one thing the Despensers had in their favour was their ability to raise finances for the king, through fiscal reforms to the royal wardrobe and chancery, as well as creating markets within England for the wool trade so that merchants didn't need to travel abroad. The Despensers despised Isabella as much as she despised them. She had exerted considerable control over Edward for a while, and she was responsible for convincing the king to exile the Despensers. She was the one person standing in the way of the Despenser family's political dominance. In May 1322, Edward announced his intention to launch a fresh campaign against Scotland. By June, when the truce between Scotland and England ended, Robert Bruce began raiding in the English north once more. Edward marched to meet him with his illegitimate son Adam by his side, but just like previous campaigns, his army found no food or supplies. By October, despite the king's optimism that there was still hope for a battle, Edward's men were starving and suffering from that worst of medieval battlefield ills, dysentery. Adam died during this campaign, most likely of dysentery, and his father had to turn back to Yorkshire for men and food. Robert Bruce took the opportunity to press him, coming south and settling at Northallerton by the 12th of October. But where was Isabella? When Edward went to Scotland, he had sent his queen to Tynemouth Priory. It must have been uncomfortable for Isabella, with not too distant memories of when she had fled the same priory years before. And unfortunately for Isabella, history was about to repeat itself. By the 14th of October, Isabella was still at the priory with her ladies-in-waiting, while Edward and the Despensers were staying at Rievaulx Abbey, a few miles east of Northallerton. Isabella felt nervous about her position, and she sent word to her husband that she wanted protection. Edward offered to send Despenser troops, but unsurprisingly, Isabella must have turned this down, as Edward changed his offer in a second letter. He instead sent Henry de Sully, a French knight, remarking that he knew this would be more agreeable than others, indicating the Despensers. When Edward received word that Robert Bruce and his Scottish army were coming towards them, he and the Despensers fled to Bridlington. In doing this, he once again abandoned his wife, very much exposed to kidnapping or attack from the advancing army. Isabella was prevented from moving south thanks to the Scottish army moving forwards, and her escape by sea was difficult because of Flemish ships loyal to Scotland patrolling the area. She also knew it would be next to impossible to withstand a siege. Isabella was instead forced to use the squires within her household, and they bravely tried to reinforce the priory's defences before managing to commandeer a ship to escape south by sea. Fighting broke out as Isabella and her ladies-in-waiting were hurried onto the ship. 2 of her ladies-in-waiting died, one from drowning while out at sea and another after they disembarked after dodging hostile Flemish ships. This time, after landing safely at Scarborough and preparing to go to York to Edward, Isabella's fury knew no limits. It was the 2nd time her husband had abandoned her at Tynemouth Priory, and once had been too much. She realised that Edward had put both his own safety and that of Hugh above her own, and her immediate response was to blame Despenser. And when the king's messengers arrived to meet her, they informed her that not only had Edward left Revo, but Robert Bruce had swept in and taken everything left there, and then defeated the king's forces at Byland. It snapped the limits of Isabella's patience. When Piers Gaveston had been alive, Isabella had at first been irritated by him, but later found a way to live alongside him and his relationship with Edward. No doubt she recognised Gaveston for what he was, a peacock, merrily strutting alongside the king, a gatekeeper for the king's favour, but not a real political threat. He had got as far as he did because Edward allowed him. Isabella was also younger and less confident back then than she was now. But Hugh Despenser was a different matter. He and his father were hungry for power, sharply politically minded, and it's highly likely Hugh Despenser's interests in Edward were based more in the kingdom than in the king himself. In the 10 years after Pierce's death, Isabella had supported Edward and been the perfect queen consort. But in late 1322, this would change. After Christmas of that year, Edward announced publicly that Isabella was to travel off on a pilgrimage in 1323 around England, by herself. This was effectively the start of Isabella's separation from Edward. There isn't actually any evidence she went on pilgrimage at all, but it suggests Hugh Despenser was whispering in the king's ear and suggesting the queen be elsewhere, now the royal couple had fallen out with one another. In mid-January until the 17th of February, Isabella went to stay in the royal apartments of the Tower with her young son Prince Edward. Things grew worse in February when King Edward launched an attack on Louis de Beaumont, the Bishop of Durham, blaming him for the chaotic escape of Isabella from Tynemouth Priory. The Beaumonts, who had long been friends of the Queen's, now fell out of favour with the king. Isabella's movements after this time go quiet until several months later, although we also know much of her privileges regarding royal patronage were revoked. This was not how a queen should be treated. Hatred against Edward and Despenser grew amongst the general population. The Earl of Lancaster's treason had been forgotten, and all that was remembered was his public intentions of reducing royal oppression and tyranny. Miracles were reported at his tomb, as well as in St. Paul's at a tablet bearing his likeness. Edward tried to stomp this out by removing the tablet and refusing to allow people to visit the tomb. In 1323, 2,000 people were barred from leaving offerings at the tomb, and they attacked the king's guards, killing 2 of them. Public feeling against the weak king and his puppet master Despenser had never run so high. Sir Andrew Harclay, who had been given titles and prizes for his part in the Battle of Boroughbridge, was executed for treason. After it transpired, he had wisely tried to enact a peace treaty with the Scottish. On the 1st of August 1323, something that had only been achieved once before happened. Roger Mortimer escaped the Tower of London. He made his way to France on a ship, continuing to Paris to seek the protection of the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's brother. He was warmly received, something which rankled with Edward back across the Channel. Charles cheerfully announced that he would, of course, expel all English exiles in France, provided Edward expelled all French exiles in England, which would have included Despenser. While there is no evidence for it, it's possible Isabella could have recognised that the only person able to stand against the tyranny of the Despensers was Mortimer, and she may have even recommended him to her brother. Tensions with France grew, and this would have a detrimental effect on Isabella. Edward fell out with Charles and twice postponed paying homage for Gascony. Finally sick of waiting, Charles declared Gascony forfeit in July 1324, sending an army in to take it the following month. By the end of 1324, Despenser and Edward removed Isabella's lands, cut her annual income from 10,000 marks to 1,000 marks, arrested her French attendants, and took over her household. But worse than this, Isabella's youngest children, John, Eleanor, and Joan, were removed from her under the spurious reasoning that being French, she might convince them to commit treason against their father. A common myth about Isabella is that she was not maternal, but there's no evidence for this. In fact, even though, as was practice for the time, her eldest son went to live in his own household at the age of 5, her other children remained with her, suggesting she was very actively involved in their upbringing. Equally, they would remain devoted to their mother for her entire life. Isabella was heartbroken and furious by this point, and she smuggled out letters to her brother Charles complaining about her treatment. The French king was enraged for his sister and sent demands that Edward treat her better, which were ignored. On the 18th of November, Edward announced that the upkeep for the Queen's food and drink would be reduced to 2,920 marks a year, roughly £1 a day, and any French subjects remaining in France would be arrested. Despite the risks, 27 of Isabella's loyal servants and chaplains had stayed with her, and they were shut up in various religious houses across England. Isabella must have been stunned at her husband's vindictiveness. While she had expected such treatment from Despenser, it was still shocking coming from Edward. Isabella had been a loyal and patient wife. She had given her husband 4 healthy children and had stood by him through stupid political decisions, failed battles with Scotland, and even his infatuation with Piers Gaveston. She had done nothing to deserve the treatment she got from her husband. As tensions grew with France and her marriage crumbled into nothing, word came that Mortimer was raising an army in Hainault. The Pope, who had suggested the marriage of Isabella and Edward in the sense of a lasting peace between France and England, suggested Isabella should be sent to smooth relations. An escape route had been opened for her. The king's envoys put pressure on Edward to let her go as well, stating that Charles had agreed that if Prince Edward was made Duke of Aquitaine and he went with his mother to pay homage, the French king would restore all lands taken from the English crown. While some later historians, especially in the Victorian period, would claim all of her actions from this point on were of a harlot queen ready to turn viciously on her rightful husband, it's clear the English queen actually had little choice. To continue as things were would have been to leave her children without a mother, herself without any dignity, and England to the Despensers. It was finally agreed, and Isabella and Prince Edward set off, arriving in Paris in March 1325. A truce with Gascony was quickly agreed upon, and the Queen's 13-year-old son paid homage for the lands England held in France to his uncle in September of that year. However, although she was supposed to go back to England at this point, Isabella refused to do so. Edward was outraged and demanded Isabella return at once, but she retorted that she was afraid that either Despenser would have her killed or even that Edward himself might order it. Charles IV also replied that his sister had come of her own free will, and that if she wished to remain, she could. She was his sister, and as such, he would not expel her or Prince Edward. He also changed his mind about lands in Aquitaine, refusing to return them, resulting in a temporary arrangement where England held administration of the remaining lands under its claim, but France had the lion's share. Even if someone had agreed with Edward in regards to his wife, no one could deny he was failing politically as a ruler. It was also around this time that Isabella began to surround herself with allies. Many of these were opposed to the Despensers or had been victims of their and the king's rough treatment, and they fled to Paris and flocked to the Queen. It's unlikely Isabella set out for France to set up opposition to Edward, more that she hoped to threaten to leave him from a safe place until he rid himself of Hugh, but nevertheless, she was the natural choice for dissenters. She was joined by the Earl of Richmond as one of her primary supporters, Henry de Beaumont, with whom she had long been friends, and even Edward's own brother, the Earl of Kent. For Isabella herself, she publicly snubbed some of Edward's closest allies and began to dress as a widow, claiming Hugh Despenser had destroyed her marriage. And she still had Prince Edward with her. Not only was keeping him in France a good threat against King Edward, who was fond of his son, but it also allowed Isabella to potentially agree to a marriage of her son to someone who would aid her politically against her husband. Furthermore, it offered another possibility, that of replacing the father with the son altogether. Sometime in 1325, Isabella's cousin, Jeanne, Countess of Hainault, approached her with an offer of marriage between Prince Edward and her own daughter, Philippa of Hainault. It was a good alliance. It meant Isabella could invade England with an army not raised from France, which would win her no favours with the English, and Hainault would be a lucrative trading partner. During this, Jeanne also reintroduced the Queen to Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had been at the Hainault court raising men for an invasion of England with the full support of William I, Count of Hainault. We don't know the circumstances of their actual early meetings, but by December of 1325, Mortimer and Isabella were having a passionate affair. It was said not only that they found each other attractive, but also that they shared an interest in Arthurian legends, fine art, and expensive tastes. However, despite the strength Isabella had shown so far, this was not a partnership of equals. Reportedly, Mortimer dominated Isabella and made most of the decisions, and while this may seem odd, Isabella was possibly more than happy to have a man in a strong position looking out for her interests, even if it was probably mostly because they aligned with his. He may also have exerted a certain amount of sexual control over her, not surprising considering the loveless and sexless marriage she had been in for the past 2 decades. However, in public, the pair gave no indication of their private affair. It was a dangerous choice for Isabella. She lived during a time when adultery was almost the worst sin a wife could commit, and for a queen it was treason. However, perhaps surprisingly, many of those who were her allies turned a blind eye, so long as the alliance served them well. By the summer of 1326, Roger and Isabella took Prince Edward with them and left the French court, travelling to Hainault. There, the betrothal between 13-year-old Philippa and Prince Edward took place, and using the dowry, Isabella was able to build up an army. William, the Count of Hainault, also offered up several ships as part of the marriage agreement. Isabella even got word to the Scottish King, Robert Bruce, who was all too willing to make a mutual agreement against Edward. On the 22nd of September, Isabella, Mortimer, and Prince Edward set sail for England. 2 days later, on the 24th, their ship landed near the mouth of the River Orwell on the east coast of England. They had a small army with them, which most estimates place around 1,500 men, and Isabella quickly moved inland. While her provisions were unpacked, the Queen quickly wrote letters to the citizens of England's towns and cities, explaining she had come to avenge the death of the Earl of Lancaster and to rid the realm of the Crown's enemies, namely the Despensers. She was met cheerfully as she travelled to Bury St Edmunds, then on to what was likely Ipswich. When her soldiers went looking for food and supplies, the local people came to her and complained that their goods had been taken. Isabella asked them what a fair price was and paid them, something which was a good bit of PR for her. Edward issued orders to sheriffs to stop Isabella when he received word on the 27th of the invasion, but they soon switched sides when it became clear how many nobles had mobilised behind the hard-done-by Queen. London became unsafe due to unrest, although most of its citizens were on Isabella's side, and Edward fled towards Wales. By the 7th of October, Isabella and Mortimer had reached the outer walls of the City of London, but by the 9th, Edward was in Gloucester. The Queen swiftly marched west in order to cut him off, but he slipped across the border to Wales before she arrived. The elder Hugh Despenser still held Bristol against Isabella and Mortimer, but they now had a force to be reckoned with, and by the 18th of October, they placed the town and castle under siege. By the 26th of October, it had fallen, and Isabella was also able to be reunited with her daughters Eleanor and Joan. She was overjoyed at seeing them once again, but the occasion wasn't all happy. Isabella had never had a huge issue with the elder Despenser, who, although she knew to be politically ambitious, had shown her no animosity personally. She attempted to protect him from the raging mob, but to no avail. His Lancastrian enemies executed him, rather grimly chopping his body into pieces and feeding it to their dogs. It was a dark cloud that foreshadowed what was to come. Now in a desperate position, Edward, who was now down to a pathetic guard of 12 archers, and Hugh Despenser the younger, attempted to sail in a small boat to Lundy, an island in the Bristol Channel. The weather was not on their side, however, and they were pushed back to the mainland. Isabella set up her base in Hereford and asked Henry of Lancaster, brother of the late Earl of Lancaster, to find her husband and arrest him. After 2 weeks of evading capture, Edward and Hugh Despenser were finally caught near Llantrisant on the 16th of November. Revenge would be swift. Edmund Fitzalan, one of Edward's closest supporters, and Hugh Despenser the younger were brought before Isabella. Edmund was sentenced to execution, although this was apparently on the orders of Mortimer. He was beheaded, but some accounts suggest a blunt sword was purposely used in order to require several strokes. Hugh could expect little mercy. Knowing this, he attempted to starve himself before his trial, but with no luck. His trial was a show trial, and Despenser wasn't allowed to speak in his own defence. His gruesome execution included being hung as a thief and drawn and quartered as a traitor, as well as having his entrails removed and burned while he was still alive. On the 24th of November 1326, Despenser was dragged out to an angry mob bent on retribution, who put a crown of nettles on his head and wrote scripture on his skin after stripping him naked. But another terrible punishment awaited the condemned man, that of castration, which can only have been a particular punishment added on by Isabella for the suspected crimes of Hugh sleeping with Edward. We know that Isabella and Mortimer were present as they watched their enemy die a horrific death, but unfortunately, we don't know what the Queen's actual thoughts were. Many myths sprang up in later years that she had eaten a meal while watching, or at least an apple. The truth is we don't know, but no doubt she was relieved at Despenser's death. Now the only problem left was Edward. Lawfully, he was still Isabella's husband and the anointed king, and there was nothing in law that described the process to remove a monarch. But it was clear the English people would no longer put up with Edward as king. As a temporary measure, he was placed into the custody of Henry of Lancaster at Kenilworth Castle, and the king's Great Seal was given to the Queen on the 26th of November. Once this was in her possession, Isabella began using it to create writs in Edward's name. She took the Tower of London under her control and convened a council in Wallingford to discuss what Edward's fate would be. It was decided Edward II would be legally deposed, something that had never happened before, and that his son would take the throne as Edward III. As young Edward was still not an adult, it was also decided that Isabella would be regent, but of course, as she was literally and figuratively in bed with Mortimer, he would also make the decisions. This was hardly a done deal, however, as the legal basis for deposing Edward II was shaky. There was also the delicate matter of whether Isabella, as his legal wife, should go to stay with him in his imprisonment. However uncomfortable a subject this may have been, it was decided that the threats Edward had previously made against Isabella's life meant it was unthinkable that she join him, especially as she also needed to be regent for her young son. These decisions were ratified at the first Parliament without the king on the 7th of January 1327. A deputation of clergy was sent to persuade the king to give up his crown to his son freely, especially as Edward III refused to take the crown without his father's blessing after seeing Isabella weeping at the decision made. Isabella excused the Franciscans from sending one of their order as part of the deputation, as Edward II had always been devoted to their order. This shows that, unlike the hardened woman the Queen is often painted as, she did still care about the feelings of her husband and perhaps felt pity for him, despite all that had happened. For the sake of his son, Edward capitulated the crown of England. The reign of Edward III officially began on the 25th of January 1327, and he was crowned in Westminster a few days later on the 1st of February. The deposed King Edward II was then moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in the Welsh borders, under the custody of Lord Thomas Berkeley. One of Edward III's first moves was to award his mother an annual income of over £13,000 per year, rather than the £4,400 she had previously been given. While this was a huge sum of money, and would later be used as evidence of Isabella's avarice, it was also about patronage. Her son's new regime was a shaky one, and she would have needed to consolidate both his position and her own by giving favours and extending royal patronage. No doubt, any later greed on her part came from a desire to never again be in the difficult financial position she had been in during her early years as a bride and under the rule of the Despensers. She also purchased and was given several properties and landholdings, making her one of the wealthiest landowners in the kingdom. On the 23rd of September 1327, there came some distressing news. Edward II was dead. All they were told by the messenger was that it was due to a fatal accident. His body was buried at Gloucester Cathedral, and his heart was given to Isabella in a silver casket. However, this was too neat a solution, and so rumours soon began. It was known that plots to free him had sprung up, and there had been 3 failed escape attempts by this time. It is possible that Edward died of ill health due to his treatment. While he was supposed to be looked after to the standard of his birth, and £5 was sent every day for his upkeep, and records at the castle show luxuries bought on his behalf, many chroniclers of the time suggested he hadn't received these goods. But other rumours circulated that he had been murdered. But on whose orders? The third plot to free Edward had been planned by Rhys ap Griffith, a Welsh knight. Word of this got out to several of Mortimer's allies, including William de Shalford, who wrote to him to tell him of the plot. Edward II being free was a threat to Isabella's regime, but it was a far bigger threat to Mortimer and his place behind the English throne. It was later claimed that Mortimer then took William de Shalford's letter to a trusted retainer, telling them to show the letter to the king's jailers and to quickly remedy the situation in order to avoid great peril. This was in early September, and in view of what came a few weeks later, can only be interpreted as orders to quietly murder the king. Roger was in Wales at this time, and Isabella was 130 miles away in London. So if this is what happened, it would appear Isabella had nothing to do with it. Later historians would point the finger of murder at the Queen, but there is actually no evidence pointing to this, and it seems more likely that the hindsight version of her as a fallen woman committing adultery was simply embellished. In fact, despite the accusations of letters and orders, there is no evidence whatsoever of a plot to murder Edward II. A minority of historians suggest Edward may have escaped and made his way to Europe, but again, there is no evidence for this, and it seems the most unlikely outcome. The following year in 1328, on the 24th of January, Edward III married Philippa of Hainault in a lavish ceremony at York Minster. However, while it was normal for the Queen Mother to then give up her dower lands to her new daughter-in-law, this didn't happen. Isabella seems to have been reluctant to give up her position, and Philippa's coronation was postponed. The reasons for this can't be good ones. It's possible Isabella was jealous of Philippa, who was about to have a happy marriage with a youthful husband. The king Isabella was never able to have. She may have been sharing a bed with Mortimer, but as his wife was still alive, she could not marry him or publicly acknowledge him. It's also possible that after being so close to her son, as well as having such control over him as mother and regent, she was jealous of the way the new queen would influence young Edward. Scotland was still an issue. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Isabella was realistic about the war with Scotland, and she knew that she had enough on her plate. A decision was made to find peace with Robert Bruce, and although Edward III initially opposed it, he eventually agreed. But he bitterly declared publicly that the whole thing had been arranged by the Queen Mother and Mortimer. Peace was formally drawn up with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, bringing an end to the First Scottish War of Independence. Part of the treaty was also that Isabella's daughter, Joan, would marry David Bruce, heir apparent to the Scottish throne. Edward III would renounce any English claim to Scottish lands. The Scottish would send an army against any enemy except the French, and compensation would be given for the border raids to the tune of £20,000. However, those earls who had lost Scottish landholdings were not compensated. and the compensation that was given was taken by Isabella for the treasury. Overall, it was not a popular move. Many nobles became disillusioned with the new regime, including those who had once been close to the Queen, including Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and Henry de Beaumont. In order to help with public opinion, Isabella reformed royal powers of administration and local law enforcement, as well as deciding to pursue her son's claim to the French throne. While this was popular at home, it was understandably not popular with the French nobility, who threw the claims out. By the end of 1328, the country seemed ready to descend once more into civil war. Lancaster mobilised his forces and declared he was against Isabella and Mortimer. Mortimer had irritated much of the nobility by his overuse of power, especially with the fact that Roger had been created Earl of March by the young king. His ennoblement made him insufferable and haughty, and he began to act as though he was a king himself, travelling everywhere with a retinue of 180 men-at-arms and living an expensive lifestyle. In January 1328, Mortimer led an army to Lancaster's stronghold at Leicester, taking it and then marching to Bedford. Edward III rode north to force Lancaster to submit, and surprisingly, so did Isabella. As his allies deserted him, Lancaster must have realised he had little choice but to kneel before Edward and Isabella, and he did so at Bedford. He escaped death as a punishment, but was forfeit to an enormous fine, and Henry de Beaumont fled to France. Around this time, Edward III seems to have started becoming restless of his mother taking over so much control of royal matters, but he especially had an issue with Mortimer. Isabella may have been greedy and overstepped the mark at times, but her son was fond of her, knew she had been through a traumatic life, and she was still a queen. Mortimer, on the other hand, was not royalty yet acted like a king, and it was also obvious that many of Isabella's decisions were at least heavily influenced by her lover. By 1330, Edward III had quietly gathered a loyal body of support from both the church and the nobles. He had also grown increasingly angry at the way his young wife was being sidelined, especially as she was now pregnant, and it was unthinkable that she should give birth without being crowned as queen. Isabella and Mortimer, under pressure from Edward, gave up some of the Queen's dower lands, and arrangements were made for Philippa's coronation. Finally, on the 4th of March 1330, Philippa was crowned as Queen of England. Tensions grew, and by July, Mortimer and Isabella had placed themselves in Nottingham Castle with security, after Roger heard of plots to get rid of him. The young king had had enough, and after being summoned to a meeting with Isabella, Mortimer, and a young nobleman who supported him named William Montague, when Mortimer declared that the king's word was in opposition to his own, it was to be ignored. Edward decided to act. On the 19th of October, Montague was charged with leading 23 armed men into the castle by a secret tunnel. Edward knew he was watched by Mortimer's spies, and so remained inside the castle, sneaking downstairs to meet with his men after retiring for the night. They burst into Isabella and Mortimer's chambers, where they were having a meeting with other council members, discussing the arrest of Montague, and fighting broke out. Mortimer was overwhelmed, and Isabella apparently, although Edward had remained outside the door and out of sight, cried out, fair son, take pity on gentle Mortimer." She was ignored. Parliament was called the next month, and Mortimer was put on trial for treason, for behaving as a king and ignoring the Regency Council, for questioning the king's word, and worst of all, he was accused of murdering Edward II. Isabella, however, was portrayed as an innocent bystander to proceedings, and no mention was made of her affair with Roger Mortimer. This shows that Edward III, perhaps through a mixture of his fondness for his mother, his pity for all she had previously been through, and his determination to be done with the complicated mess his parents had created, wanted to preserve what was left of her reputation. Mortimer was sentenced to death and was hanged on the 29th of November 1330 at Tyburn, but Edward III showed leniency in not having him drawn and quartered. Edward wasted no time in cementing his authority, and Isabella was sent to Windsor Castle to be put under house arrest. Victorian historians would dramatically suggest she went mad, but at most, it's more likely she suffered a breakdown after the death of Mortimer. She remained at Windsor only until 1332, when she was allowed to move to her own property of Castle Rising in Norfolk. In March of 1332, Queen Philippa gave birth to a daughter who was named Isabella after her grandmother, a conscious effort to rehabilitate Isabella at court. She remained a wealthy woman, with Edward ensuring in 1331 she was given an annual income of £3,000, which had risen to £4,000 by 1337. As per her tastes, Isabella continued to enjoy a lavish lifestyle in her middle age, employing a retinue of entertainers and singers and travelling around Europe. She also gave to religious institutions, in 1347 patronising the convent of the Poor Clares. She was occasionally involved in politics, such as in 1358, when she was part of the peace talks with Charles II of Navarre. Her daughter Joan left her husband David II for his unfaithfulness and their loveless marriage in 1357, no doubt inspired by her mother's bravery in refusing to come home to a husband who did not care for her. She remained with Isabella, nursing her as she grew older. Isabella was very fond of her grandchildren, especially Edward the Black Prince, and she was visited frequently by her family as well as members of the court. As she came to the end of her long life, Isabella took the habit of the Third Order of St. Francis, wearing it beneath her clothes. In July of that year, she fell ill after overdosing on a medicine that had been prescribed to her for another ailment. On the 22nd of August 1358, with her daughter Joan by her side, in her early 60s, Isabella of France died. She was given a magnificent funeral by Edward III, her body buried at Greyfriars Church in Newgate, wrapped in her habit and the cloak she had worn on her wedding day. She was also buried, at her request, with the silver casket containing Edward's heart. Isabella would go down in history as possibly the most hated medieval woman, and as a queen who became a harlot, a she-wolf waiting to pounce on her lawful husband. In reality, the truth is much more complicated. She had started life as a princess groomed to be a queen, certain all kings were like her father, who doted on his wife and ruled with a rod of iron. But when she had arrived to become England's queen, Isabella found herself playing second fiddle to a man, neglected by her husband and pushed aside at every opportunity. But she remained by her husband's side in these early years, supporting him even through his failures, bearing him 4 healthy children and doing her duty as queen. It was only when she was pushed by his new favourite, Hugh Despenser, her children removed and her life reduced to poverty, that Isabella decided to fight back, not so much a she-wolf as a woman with no choice left, just as her contemporaries saw it. Victorian attitudes would have much effect on how her relationship with Roger Mortimer was seen, but through modern eyes, we can understand how a woman starved of love and affection would want a few years of happiness with a caring lover, even if the consequences were dire. She cared deeply for her children, especially her eldest son Edward III, and even in old age, Edward II never left her thoughts. In reality then, Isabella was a kind and intelligent woman, who was also greedy and had expensive tastes. A woman who was willing to put up with a loveless marriage, so long as it was a partnership, who both grew her allies and pushed them away. She was even willing to go against the constraints of her time for women, so long as it served a greater purpose for her son and her own life. In short, Isabella was an ordinary woman pushed to her limits in an extraordinary time, who changed the face of England's politics forever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.